One of the issues though is that schools just refuse to give out this data, right? The only reason we have the Harvard data is because they got involved in a lawsuit, and then they were served discovery, and they had to legally answer it, right?
Do you think universities' insistence on doing stuff like that is entirely optically motivated? What's the incentive?
Huge part of it is look who's on the fucking brochures at these universities. Just open one.
You don't think I will counter this by saying, hey, look, it is fair that there's almost no data on affirmative action, but there's also no data that schools give out generally. Almost
why?
The government is highly motivated to make sure that their most upwardly mobile citizens are the least hamstrung in being economically viable.
So wait, no. So a couple things here.
Hello. Welcome, one and all, to yet another episode of WhickTV, a cross-ideological space where we come together to talk about issues both political and cultural, from the silly to the serious. We have one more guest that will be joining us soon. NotSoErudite is running a little late, but she did message me and said she'd be here in about 5 to 10 minutes. So when she gets here, we'll slot her in, but until then, we'll just go with the flow, gang. We'll go with the flow. It's been a day. We are going to talk about racial preferences in college admissions, affirmative action for colleges. This is something that has been legal for a while, but recently the Supreme Court has heard a case that might overturn the ruling that they made back in 2003 that allowed this stuff. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether or not we should have racial preferences in college admissions. Yeah. With that, sorry, I'm a little scatterbrained. With that, we'll just get into it, and we're going to start with our friend, Doubleshine. Go ahead.
Hey, what's up, guys? So, in general, my argument for affirmative action is that I think it is pretty much undoubtedly some kind of racial discrimination. So the argument is going to be whether or not there is some tangible benefit to have racial discrimination in the college system. Personally, I don't think that exists, and I think that there's also a lot of problems that are created in this pursuit for diversity, such as tokenization among the campus. You have a lot of racial divides right now between Asian and Black Americans, where Asians are vastly disproportionately affected by affirmative action. And when you look at the test results necessary to get into some of these top campuses, it's outstanding. It really is insane how much higher an Asian has to score compared to a Black or a Latino. So I think in general, the big thing that's up at stake as far as the Supreme Court decision goes has been the racial check mark. So that's you're just checking your race. But if you want to talk about your race in the form of I was a first generation immigrant coming to the States and my parents don't speak any English, I think all of that handled in the essay gives you a very good opportunity to show your racial diversity as well as your diversity of experience without relying on I'm 1/8 Native American, so I'm checking the box.
Okay, well, thank you for being here, Double, and I'm sure we'll get into it as we go. Next up, NotSoErudite, I'm glad you're here, but we're just doing intros right now, so it's just in time. Next up, Lucy, please, first time guest on my channel. What are your thoughts?
Should I introduce myself
first
go before giving my thoughts?
If you'd like.
Okay, so I'm 𝕾𝖎𝖎𝙑, the biggest Polish trans streamer, or should I say probably only Polish trans streamer, which makes me the biggest by default. And I'm probably going to be giving a little bit of an outsider perspective since I'm from Poland. And the college and university admission process in Poland is quite different here. The whole schooling system is quite different in Poland than in the US. There are a lot of things that sort of work differently here. But my position basically on affirmative action is that it is a band-aid to a pretty big systemic problem that has been caused by many years of systemic discrimination. We could even take it back to slavery, to be honest. And the system of affirmative action, while a band-aid that does not really address or try to fix any of the systemic problems that are still present within US society, in my opinion, it still sort of tries to address certain inequity within the system. And as such, I think the US should not really do away with it. It's not really about, in my opinion, at least meeting a racial quota, or from what I even know, the quota thing is illegal in the US, but it's more about allowing certain people from certain disadvantaged communities to get a chance at education. And from what I am aware, the affirmative action in certain ways goes even beyond race, since certain soft requirements that give you points are also given for being from a poor white communities in certain schools, for sure. So I guess that's it.
Well, yeah, we'll get into it in the open, I am sure. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Next up, a last-minute replacement, so thank him immensely. Kilo, the giant.
Hey.
Hi.
Yeah, glad I was able to make it. I definitely have not prepared a whole lot, so I'm going to be a little bit scattered on this. Generally speaking, I think I'm never really opposed to equity. I think there are definitely practical applications for equity. In this case, I kind of tend to agree with a lot of what Lucy said. It does feel sort of like a Band-Aid. It feels like we're commodifying people in sort of ways that don't really address the reasons that put us in the position of feeling like we need to do this in the first place. So I would be okay with things like affirmative action if we had like a guarantee the underlying foundational issues were being addressed. Obviously, in this case, I think there are negative, like the article I'm reading from Politica says that there are negative repercussions in a lot of cases of affirmative action, in that other minority groups might be disadvantaged, such as like Asian Americans have a harder time getting admitted into certain colleges. That's like inherently a negative to me. So yeah, I'm a little bit back and forth, but generally I think probably I'm in favor of moving away from stuff like this and addressing the core issues that led us to be in the position in the first place.
Okay, well, thank you. And again, I really appreciate you coming in last minute. Really helps me out. Next up, NotSoErudite, please.
Hi. Yeah. So, in my estimation, there are 3 solid arguments for affirmative action that I can kind of figure out that people make. The first one is going to be addressing education inequality. The second one is viewed as some sort of compensation or reparation. And the third one is diversity. I basically reject the last 2. I'm not interested in reparations to the education system. I think that reparations in general are a really bad precedent. And diversity seems to almost never actually be the purpose behind affirmative action. One thing that is interesting to me is the question of education inequality. I believe education inequality is a serious issue in America. I think it is pretty self-evident that socioeconomic status and race are inextricably linked. Even just zip code basis of education is an important question when it comes to people's access to higher education and educational achievement. The question is, I believe education inequality exists. My question is, does affirmative action actually address it? If it does, I'm for it. If it doesn't, if it's failing to actually have the meat behind it, then I would be wholly against it.
I guess we'll find out which it is during the course of this panel, and we can make that judgment. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate you. Next up, Staxiums, please go ahead.
Hey, so I wrote out a little bit of, just a little bit. So look, I certainly don't have a love for affirmative action. There are about 20 policy positions I'd advocate for to address inequality before I'd advocate for this one. But this feels like a person missing a leg, and we're debating if we should take the Band-Aids off, as Lucy said earlier. Band-Aids are imperfect and absolutely not a forever solution, but at least it kind of stops the infection. I'm not going to be arguing that affirmative action is perfect, but that it's vaguely possible and would be bad for racial justice to revoke it. Also, WhickTV has already confirmed that what this argument will be about, but just to re-clarify, I'm not going to argue on the legal validity of the Supreme Court case, but just the efficacy of affirmative action.
Thank you. And we'll get into it. And last, certainly not least, person who brought this topic to me, Lactoid. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I've had a very stressful day and I've had a little bit of wine and I'm feeling very aggressive. And it's unfortunate because so far the takes have been given have been pretty reasonable. And I was looking for someone who's going to defend this so I could destroy them. But I'm going to have to settle for destroying some imaginary affirmative action defender. Affirmative action is racial discrimination. There's no other way around it. By definition, you are discriminating against people based on their race. The only questions are how pervasive is this, and is it a good thing? Well, strangely, despite 74% of Americans opposing affirmative action, it's incredibly pervasive. It's in grants, employment, and education. Unsealed data from the Harvard lawsuit indicated that without a racial affirmative action and without legacy admissions, only 31% of black student admins would have gotten into Harvard in 2019. That means without affirmative action and without legacy, which white people disproportionately benefit from, if you remove those two from the circumstances, 2/3 of black student admins in Harvard were not good enough to get into on their own merit. Asians, on the other hand, someone brought up how Asians are discriminated against. This is absolutely true. Would have seen their numbers rise by 33%. Yes, that's right. That means 1 out of 3 Asian applicants don't get into Harvard solely because of their race. Is this a good thing? Well, the data on this, I've been doing a deep dive, is incredibly mixed. A lot of data actually indicates that it's bad for cumulative GPA and performance. Some indicates that when you control for very narrow demographics, it can be good. But clearly, it's not enough to meet the test for strict scrutiny. Generally speaking, I don't think the government should be racially discriminating. I don't think it leads to good outcomes, and it's fucking racist. So.
Affirmative action, racist? I guess we'll find out tonight, gang. Okay, with that, if you have trouble getting in, just let me see your hands and let's get into it. What do we think? What's the panel's deal? Go ahead.
Right.
Lactoid.
Hit me.
Is racial discrimination always the same thing as racist?
If the government's racially discriminating, I think that's always racist. Yes.
So,
I have a quick follow-up question. Do you feel like welfare or something is also discriminating against poor people? Because it seems like
Well,
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
it's
exactly.
discriminating against rich people because they don't get it.
well, but no, you're benefiting indiscriminately poor people, right? So you're like it seems like you're arguing is that it's racially targeted towards black people where they're benefiting from
Yeah.
it where they shouldn't. So that's racial discrimination. Welfare generally is benefiting poor people in ways where they wouldn't have gotten it otherwise. The government is leaning in to support them. Do you feel like they're discriminated against there?
Well, so let me be clear. The people that are discriminated against in affirmative action are primarily Asians. The data seems to indicate that it has a marginal effect on white people. It's not actually as much as people say, but 1/3 of Asians are cut out because of
Sure.
race.
So you're
Now,
talking about the people who are
Yeah. So when I'm talking about the people who are racially discriminated against, I'm talking about the people who lose out, not the people who benefit. I would say welfare probably discriminates against rich people, but I think that's, although I'm against welfare generally, I think it's better to discriminate against rich people than it is to discriminate against Asians when it comes to government programs.
So just curious for the panel, I'm curious if like affirmative action were instead to be directed towards like income based, like basically from poor communities rather than just based off of race. Would anyone have any objections to that? Because I would largely say that would be more positive. It
No,
would be more difficult, but it would be more positive.
yeah, and in fact, I would even say that, like, for me, like, getting rid of affirmative action and doing nothing is probably a pretty bad thing, but instead focusing on, giving resources to low income neighborhoods, even if that is predominantly black or Hispanic neighborhoods, focusing on their K-12 education, to me that seems like all the best ways to fix the problems. I know 𝙎𝙪𝙗 brought up the like education inequality, which to me is, I would agree, is the only good argument. I don't really care about like the diversity thing.
Lucy, go ahead.
okay. So from what I've been learning about the topic, there seem to be a couple of misconceptions. One of them being that if a affirmative action candidate gets chosen, a different candidate has to lose out or be thrown away. Like that an affirmative action candidate means that either a white person loses a spot or an Asian in this case loses a spot, and this does not seem to be the case from what I'm learning. And also the affirmative action is actually not just a thing that starts and ends with choosing a person to be allowed to go to a school. It actually starts with things like creating materials that would attract groups that would otherwise be more hesitant to even apply to a school. It also continues with, well, not all schools do this, but it also continues with continued support to certain people. And to a degree, certain schools, because in the US, it seems that criteria for getting in are different from school to school. But from the schools that I have checked, how the distribution of the 150 points that are needed to get in are allotted, there are actually certain soft criteria that could be actually qualified as certain affirmative action methods do target poor white communities.
Lucy, so is it, just really quickly, on the point of whether certain groups might be excluded as a result of affirmative action, is it not somewhat intuitive that if a college can only admit a certain number of students per semester, that if there were a concerted effort and focus on admitting a certain demographic of students, that other ones might be inorganically negatively impacted by that?
Well, from what I know, quotas themselves are basically just illegal in the US.
They will
It is
tell you that
illegal
quotas
to-
don't exist, but I'm saying, isn't it intuitive that, like, if you can only admit so many students per semester, wouldn't it just make sense that if there were this like concerted effort to admit a certain demographic, that other demographics would then suffer as a result of that?
There are two aspects to this. On the level in which affirmative action most goes into play, usually it's not like there are 15 or even 5 people fighting for the same spot, from what I've been informed. And usually sorts of even special places are made for people that are deemed that they should have a chance at education. It usually is not really done at an expense of some other. It's not treated as like a tournament between students that fight it out.
I need to interrupt though. What is the rejection rate? Do we know the rejection rate of prestigious colleges in America? Like, does anyone have that data? Like,
It's
if
Like lower than 5%,
It
I'm
wouldn't-
sure.
Like what?
It's,
what
no,
is
it's
prestige?
incredibly
What?
high.
Or sorry,
The-
I meant acceptance rate.
undergrad?
lower than
the
5,
acceptance
yeah.
rate's very low. You can look
Yes.
this up.
the
And-
rejection rate is not really relevant to this question
Why not?
because a person can be rejected for various things, not necessarily connected
4%.
to the affirmative action.
Acceptance rate of 4% at Harvard, just so everyone has that number.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
5%, yeah.
so you have incredibly low. So okay, not only is it intuitive, but it's just like statistically backed. I'll post the study if you guys want to read it. Like models have been done, studies have been done, and if affirmative action at Harvard didn't exist, the Asian population would be increased by a third.
Sure.
Right? Like
that-
literally a
that's-
third of Asians don't get in because they lose their spot to Black students. That is
So
what
the
happens.
way, if I could outline this, the way you're going to compel me is also showing that it doesn't actually address education and inequality. I'm biased to, I'll be clear about my bias. I suspect it doesn't. I suspect it's extremely ineffective. The problem is this is going to be really hard to study. The closest I could find was a South African study on labor markets over 10 years with affirmative action policy, where there was like some marginal benefits. We saw like specific demographics did benefit a little bit, but the targeted demographics, which was African men specifically, didn't benefit much at all. So
Yeah,
that's what
it's-
I'm mostly interested in. is
Can I ask,
education.
when you say equality, are you talking about education equality? What are you referring to? Are you talking about like equity, like outcome-based analysis, or what are you referring to?
So when I'm talking about educational quality, I am talking about a mixture of both opportunity and then therefore also going back into those same communities and like uplifting those communities. So when I'm talking about educational inequality, I'm talking about how there is kind of this like legacy pattern that like if you have parents that go to university, you're more likely to go to university and your kids are, therefore, and there's kind of this intergenerational effect of kind of lifting the entire generations out of poverty. That's the specific thing that I'm curious in. So say we're bringing a student who has like a slightly lower GPA in because of race specifically. The question that would only make AA maybe possibly viable is by doing that, when that person graduates, do they go back to their own community and help uplift the community overall? That's the question that I'm
Okay, well, I want to two things. First of all, it's not by a small percentage. Now, you may advocate for a small percentage, but like I just said, like the percentages are massive, right? 2/3. There's a massive difference and a massive effect of this thing. This isn't like a small, like, oh, they both have the same SAT. Which one are we going to pick? No, it's 2/3 wouldn't have been able to get in. Black students would have not been able to get into Harvard absent these kind of policies that they're now being sued for.
Yeah, so that actually introduces another complicating thing, which is affirmative action in Ivy Leagues versus affirmative action in any other college, because almost all affirmative action is talked about at Ivy League schools, which is probably maybe the worst place in my view for affirmative action. But say if you go to like a college community, or if you go to like more general universities, that would maybe be a more open place where we can talk about like where like kind of everyone's education is like pretty mad. They've got an acceptance rate of like 45%, stuff like that. That's somewhere where I'm going to be way more open. I'm actually not interested in affirmative action at Ivy Leagues at all.
One of the issues though is that schools just refuse to give out this data, right? The only reason we have the Harvard data is because they got involved in a lawsuit and then they were served discovery and they had to legally answer it, right? Schools do not give out this information.
You don't have to sell me on schools being corrupt.
No, I totally.
Yeah, they fucking hide this shit. And when in California, for example, like we saw actual overall beneficial effects to statewide GPA when they banned affirmative action. But recently, we've been seeing schools figure out ways of introducing affirmative action without calling it affirmative action. So they'll say, they'll do like private interviews with students and they'll say like, oh, this student rates as more dynamic or more excitable or more interesting, right? Compared to other students. And it just so happens that Asian students, for some reason, are very low dynamism and very low excitement.
Yeah, they don't get the +4 points for being Asian.
They don't get those for some reason. But the Black students, they're very full of their dynamic abilities and excitability.
Do you think universities' like insistence on doing stuff like that is like entirely like optically motivated? Like, what's the incentive?
Huge part of it is look who's on the fucking brochures at these universities. Just open one.
You don't think that there's
a
genuine interest in like racial equity?
Yeah, I think blame falls way faster on. Yeah, I think it falls way easier on like human negligence and like stupidity than it does on like this like nefarious thing specifically. Like we just want to look good.
100% agree. I do want to cut in just really quickly and say I think that we've all looked through the studies and it's largely really hard to find hard data, like Lactoid said, and that is probably my biggest criticism of this program is that we don't have a lot of information on how exactly this runs. And I will 100% concede that immediately, that they need to be more open about the stats, because if we are discriminating against people and it doesn't even bring any outcomes, let's fucking throw it out. 100%. I think everyone is on this panel at least will agree with that diversity as a strength isn't enough if the outcomes of building the communities are enough. But what we can agree. Oh, sorry.
I would kind of agree that like there's not a ton of hard data, but like personally, I'm from California, okay, and we banned that thing like 27 years ago, and for the most part, honestly, I think it's been obviously it had like its initial downsides. I think diversity of like Black and Hispanics went down by like 50%. And that's a huge issue. But
10%.
as Lactoid mentioned, GPA skyrocketed higher. Graduation rates of the Black and Hispanics went up by a lot. I think 𝙎𝙪𝙗𝙧 even kind of mentioned this. This was like, it's something called like the mismatch theory, where when you insert, low grading, like underrepresented minority groups, they often end up performing at like the bottom quartile of their class, and they drop out, they get stuck. And it's like, is that actually benefiting these communities?
Sure.
If they went to like a community college, it would be just so much more beneficial.
Sure. So there's two pieces to this, just to be clear, when we're looking at this data. If we look at like say the 1990s when quotas were more which was just like the tail end of quotas basically, because quotas did exist before. I think it was like 1983, I have it written down somewhere, where the Civil Acts occurred and then you couldn't do quotas anymore. So we saw a massive drop, but also what we saw is the failure to graduation rate from universities specifically for people of color was at like, I think it was at like 60% when there was quotas. When we did away with quotas and we brought in now the new kind of affirmative action policies, it's jumped up to now like, I think it's like, I'd have to pull up my stats, but like in the 90s, I believe is somewhere like it skyrocketed because again, we don't have the mismatch occurring nearly as often.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one thing that we can acknowledge. Dropout rate does increase among these communities that we bring into colleges, and I do admit that. However, it's not 100%, and we do know that education is one of the highest guarantees for income, right? Like that, those are inextricably connected. Not maybe inextricably, but the higher the education, the more you can predict income. And when you are moving back to those communities and coming in with all of these higher incomes, all I can mention is that I think it's strange sometimes that we talk so much about racial inequity when it comes to college admissions, but not talk about the racial inequity that caused this problem in the first place. That they are.
That's what I'm interested in talking about.
Wait. No. So a couple things here. You said there's a bunch of shit that's being said, and we've had 40 years on this to get this data, and everyone agrees. And I have for the past 3 hours, I haven't been able to find solid research on this.
Yeah.
And that, I think that speaks volumes as to the fact of, I don't think this shit exists, and I think there's a reason why people can't find it. Right? Anecdotally, based on what I've seen, it would appear that the people who get good grades and go to college, when they don't move back to poor neighborhoods, they move into wealthy neighborhoods, right? That's what they go to. Now, I could be wrong if there was any data to suggest that I'm wrong, but there's no data to suggest I'm wrong. And the crucial point of this here is the Supreme Court in 𝙎𝖎, what they said was, there was which they're wrong about, but they said that there is, you can racially discriminate if you have an overwhelmingly good reason to do so, like strict scrutiny. If you have a very, very good reason to do so, you can do it. And what they pointed to was, well, improving diversity in schools leads to better academic outcomes. Therefore, that's enough justification for us. That's the only justification for us. But 40 years later, is that really a solid ground? Nobody can point to anything. How strong is this benefit actually? And this is what the Supreme Court is going to be deciding probably next week, which is, wow, 40 years, no data for the thing that we said was the reason you could do this. Maybe there's actually no reason for you to do this.
I will counter this by saying, hey, look, it is fair that there's almost no data on affirmative action, but there's also no data that schools give out generally just regarding admittance or just almost
why.
Anything. So, all I'm saying is you can't point to affirmative action and just say, hey, look, it's clearly not working because they're not sending data out. They're not sending data out on anything. You know what I'm saying? It's very hard when it comes to college admissions or anything like that to find any sort of data, period, regardless.
Unless they're forced to. And I'll post the data I have from Harvard. Unless they're forced to. And once they're forced to, you see ridiculous numbers. You see two-thirds of black admits only getting in because they're black.
But even look at the data of SAT scores to get into some of these schools. I've seen that Asians compared to black, it's a 450 point difference on the SAT, which is unbelievable. I mean, that's a crazy penalty that you're getting just because your last name is Kim, right? It's insane. And I think that while you said that race discrimination, we don't have a ton of data on it. I think that looking at the correlation between how much more black applicants and the test scores, they're all kind of getting sucked into these top Ivy Leagues like Harvard, like Princeton, like Yale, that can actually afford to give them more money because these are private schools that can give more money to low income families. And as a result, the actual community, the smaller public schools they're getting significantly less good applicants.
I will say that, one, I just want to account to the fact that there's a lack of data on all of this. But even pointing to SATs can be incredibly flawed because, as we know, college admissions, maybe this isn't even as we know, we don't really know. But generally speaking, SATs aren't the barrier for success on whether or not, or barrier of approval, if that makes sense. That's not the threshold. Very often they'll look at the extracurricular activities way before they'll look at SATs.
Or how dynamic you are. That's also critically important.
Exciting.
Sure.
Yeah.
Should we toss it to
True. Right up. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's fine. Finish your thought, and then Lucy can.
Sure. I guess all I'm saying is we don't have any data on how many African Americans contribute to extracurricular activities, and that could bias this sort of SAT data that we're looking at. And there's just not a lot of comprehensive data, so there can't be a lot of really done on this data. But go ahead, Lucy.
Right. So there are a few things that I would like to sort of address. That from what I'm understanding, the affirmative action is supposed to, rather than equality, it is supposed to address inequity in education. And it seems that there is some data. I don't have it on hand. I might have to look for it or maybe send it later, but there does seem to be some evidence that people that go through the affirmative action programs do go back to their communities to, as for example, teachers or other sorts of professions, and do contribute to their communities. But my bigger point is that we should probably analyze a bit, what do we mean when we say that someone deserves or does not deserve to be in education or to be admitted to a university? Because I've heard some of you say that people that do not deserve to get in, when we do have to ask ourselves what that means, because the whole system is pretty, from my perspective, convoluted. We have schools in certain neighborhoods that are underfunded because the lower the performance, the less money the schools get. So there's a spiral of worse and worse, performance. School performance apparently also lowers value of houses in the US. And you end up in a situation where there are people who are from certain areas or neighborhoods are basically set up to fail through being in a very bad school. Sometimes they even come from a poor family, so they don't even have time to do the extra activities that you need for the soft admission requirements. They don't have the money to get schooling to the best essay possible for the admission. And the question becomes, should education be, quite frankly, just gate kept behind wealth?
Yeah, and I think
Do
like one
people-
policy that we like, I think hopefully everybody here would agree on, maybe not Lactoid, I guess, would be like free higher public education for everybody in America. I think that's like a great policy.
Massive boo.
I would love to see, low income, underrepresented groups going to,
Why?
public community
Hold on,
colleges, and that's
Lactoid.
entirely free.
Why would you be against that?
All right.
He's a piece of
All
shit.
right, a couple of things.
You can't trust
I'm a data-driven individual. Okay, the first thing, when you look at in the United States from elementary and high school, the average cost per student for paying them for them to go to school is about $14,000 per year. When you look at Black students, it's actually higher. In fact, we spend more on Black students per capita per year than we do for white students. You can look this up. This kind of myth of the underfunded school is actually just that. It's a myth. Black students get more government money overall, it's only by a few $100s, right? So both they're close. It's $14,000. This is public information. You can look it up.
Wait, hold on. Are you?
I can post
When you give those numbers, yeah, I'm just curious about it. I'm just curious about that number because when you talk about the government, are you referring to like federal subsidies for like rebuilding the house or the initial structure?
For school, for tuition. So in terms of paying. Elementary school and high schoolers. So paying for them to go to school for instruction, for resources, for all that stuff. It's true that Black students per capita get a much higher percentage of their funding from federal sources as opposed to state and local sources.
Yeah, but those
because they tend to be in more poor areas. That's absolutely true. But in terms of overall money spent, Black students get more than white students in America. They're in elementary school and high school. Second of all, why should we not pay for public education in terms of like college level? Because the overall, and this is the same reason why you shouldn't have a forgiveness for student loans, the overall amount of money that you get from going to college outweighs the debt, right? It is still a financially good idea to go to college. Yeah. Why? And when you look at the most college debt and who mostly accrues college debt, it's people who go on to have incredibly high earning potentials. Why are we giving handouts to people who are going to disproportionately, by a long shot, going to go on to make a fuck ton of money?
Because like you just said, they end up earning more income to the economy. So we actually want more education.
They should pay for it. They should pay for it.
No, but they don't have the ability.
Okay, one at a time.
They make more money than the debt is. They can pay for it.
Educational forgiveness is super standard in a lot of countries. Like Canada, for example, has like some of the most like progressive education forgiveness. Like at times you can just be like, I can't pay it, and they're like, because specifically the government is highly motivated to make sure that their most upwardly mobile citizens are the least hamstrung in being being economically viable. So if somebody's making a lot of money, but they have to pay back debt for the next 10 years to school, that means all that money is going back to paying debt rather than paying into the economy. So there are massive economic benefits to like student loan forgiveness. Not that this is at all related to AA.
As
but-
yeah,
Oh, wait. I want to
as
address
well
that.
as all of the positive externalities that come from a more educated public. But
No, wait. No, let me address that because
So-
including Germany, there's a lot of countries that have public education that actually have lower college attendance rates than the U.S. As long as the overall economic benefit from going to college in the U.S. is higher than the overall debt, people are going to make that decision because overall it's more beneficial. It's interesting that you'd bring up, well, if we hamper the rich people from having more money, this is going to prevent them from going stronger in the economy. I mean, that first of all, Canada taxes the rich and the upwardly mobile citizens at a much higher rate than the U.S.
Yep.
Wouldn't that be an argument against taxing rich people since we want to keep them upwardly mobile? And second of all, why shouldn't people who are now upwardly mobile and make way more money than lower income people, why shouldn't they pay for the thing that led them to be upwardly mobile as opposed to making people who didn't benefit from that system and making them pay for it? Doesn't make
There
any
is a
sense to me.
huge difference between forgiving student debt and having free college. We are not arguing about forgiving student debt. In that case, I do think it's a regressive tax. I do think that forgiving student debt can be very regressive. However, that is different from free public education where you discourage or you basically eliminate a barrier to access. Once they've crossed that threshold, we don't need to give them more handouts, but removing that threshold down is a hugely positive.
What's the barrier?
Also, I'm specifically talking about community
the
colleges,
cost.
by the way, not like just
The
covering
cost,
every
correct.
single like.
Yeah.
Okay, wait, hold
Well,
on.
no,
Loans.
Lactoid, just to be
Loans.
clear.
So if AFSA gives you loans, and if you're poor, you can get Pell Grants, which is free money, by the way. But otherwise, you can get loans to pay for education that you pay back later, which they haven't been paying for the past 5 years because of this COVID bullshit. But if you do pay back the loans, you're going to be able to pay that back with the oversized earnings that you have now from graduating from college.
Is
I
it
agree-
not?
I
Could
agree
it
with
not?
you.
Could it not, in some instances, be a disincentive to pursue higher education?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
can
you're- no,
agree. No, we can agree. We can agree that yes, it is essentially kinda free,
Is that okay
but
for
that's
you?
not how people perceive it, and that's not how people act. And if you want to criticize the American people for being a little stupid and not recognizing, yes, this is 100% worth it, putting all of this debt in will actually be worth it, I agree. However, that's not how people act, and we have to treat people how they are, not how we want them to be.
No. There's no reason why we should first reward people for financial stupidity if they
Right.
decide to
Okay.
not go forward with the best financial action. But second of all, I'm just again, if you
not gonna
make
do that.
disproportionate earnings, why can't you pay for the thing that you
Okay.
incurred to have the disproportionate earnings? And
Okay,
I agree.
okay,
Wait,
you do.
I want to say wait. One thing that was said by Kilo. I agree that whenever you make something a ridiculously good deal, like if you were to subsidize bread by paying you $30 every time you went to the store and grabbed bread, probably
Okay.
more people would go and get bread. I don't
Well,
deny that you're going to make it an even better deal.
We need to
But then
outline.
there's the question: is do we want people going to trade schools or do we want people going getting fucking gender
Lactoid, you're
degrees?
on one today. Lactoid,
Neither.
you gotta
So-
get. Gotta
I
get
told
straight
you.
to
I told you.
Nobody's mad. So
Can
there's
I-
two things
I'm
that we have to
mad.
separate in the analogies, right? In the case of student loan forgiveness, what you're really doing is allowing the beginning states of your upwardly mobile people to be successful. So it's giving them like that bump right afterwards. Taxing higher income people is going to disproportionately affect older people who are probably already way ahead of their debts and are making a solid income overall. So to say that these two tax policies are analogous isn't true. There's a very distinctive reason why the governments will do student loan forgiveness and tax the rich for different purposes that are both valid. They're not analogous situations.
Hey, Lucy, give it a go.
Right.
They're close.
So
No.
I will address the school thing. I think giving people money to get resources, to get probably books and stuff like that, will allow them to learn at all. But from what I'm understanding, the schools themselves are still massively underfunded. The teachers are underfunded, etc., etc. There does seem to be data on that.
I'm so
And
glad
when
you.
it comes to the free education, from my perspective, it's just you lose me when you say that there shouldn't be free education. But I don't think we need to get into this since it does not seem to be the topic of today's.
I want to echo what
conversation at all.
Lucy is saying. When we talk about funding schools, there is a difference between like federal subsidies and just property taxes that are going in to invest into the school. And I just pulled it up pretty clearly. Data shows that school districts attended predominantly by students of color received $23 billion less in funding than primarily white districts, adding up to
because
$2,200
What kind of
less per
funding?
student per year. That's what I'm saying. When I'm saying, hey, there is a difference between the feds, the federal government coming in and subsidizing the school and the property taxes that are used to build the schools. Those are two separate numbers, and you keep only focusing on federal subsidies. Of course, those are going to be more for people of color because those are the ones that the feds have to step in at. Does this make sense? I don't know.
No.
And
Well, hold
I
on.
wanna
It
be
doesn't,
clear.
if there's the same, okay, hold on. If the money is being spent on the student, where the money comes from, I don't know. Like, does dollars coming from public from property taxes in the local area? Are those dollars somehow worth more than dollars coming from the
No.
federal government? I just posted
No.
the link. So the average black student attends a district that spends $14,385 per student, while the average white student attends a district that spends $14,263 per student.
Can
Black people
you,
get more money spent on them.
Can you
Yeah, but if
explain
you also
what that
look
translates
As
to?
the share
What
of
that-
black students increases, the funding also decreases.
Right,
It's the
but
No, this is
can you
per student.
also-
This is per student.
can
yeah,
you-
I'm
can you-
understanding
can
per
you-
student, but it's like I see that there's like a couple of $100 per student. The issue is that when you're
Right, but-
looking at systemic issues like spending in areas with higher or lower black student percentages, we do see a steady decrease.
Right,
Wait,
but can you explain what that funding actually goes to?
So,
What,
well, the
what
funding,
does that mean?
that's the two things I wanted to say earlier, Lactoid, was one that I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that because a lot of the problem with, I think, like disadvantaged school districts are like allocation of funding, not like the volume of funding that they receive. But then two is the next portion of this article goes into when examining the sources of the funding, the racial gaps are starker. So like, for instance, and I'm just like completely spitballing here, is this accounting for like charter schools, which do receive public funding? Because I think generally speaking, people would say charter schools are probably mostly white and do have higher levels of education.
No, well, hold on. I don't disagree that black students per capita receive a much larger percentage of their education paid for by the federal government. But again, when you look at the total amount spent, black students specifically get more money prior to college.
Right, but
I
what
posted
does
it.
that mean exactly?
So the spending goes into multiple things, right? The spending, first of all, goes into actually like tuition of elementary and high school students. So paying the teachers' salaries, organizing lesson plans, shit like this, right? Other spending includes things like school resource officers, school resource availability, all things like this, right? And when you look at the total, there's this myth of like, well, it's because they just don't get any money. But then when you look at it, you're like, wow, they actually get more money. So what do you mean?
They get
This is tying to the zip code argument. Basically,
Yes.
this is all about, because my understanding, now somebody who's American, correct me if I'm wrong, because you guys have a really weird education system. That if you're doing public school, my understanding is that you guys can only go to certain schools within zip codes. Whereas like in Canada, if I choose to go to public school that's in Montreal, I can choose to go back and forth from Alberta every day if I so choose to. It would just be fucking
Basically the
stupid.
same in
Is,
Poland.
Not
is that a correct understanding about how the zip codes work?
And not
Same-
only that, schools are in America alone are funded by property taxes. And that is a huge point that I want to point at. The fact that if you have a disenfranchised community, you're going to have poorer schools. Now, yes, the government through federal grants absolutely does subsidize that in more ways than the white communities, but that's because they need it more.
Also,
Okay,
this
wait,
also
wait,
ignores
wait.
the fact that like in private, so like if you're a richer family, you also have more money to afford extracurriculars. You have more money to send your kids to Kumon. That's why Asian and whites typically do a lot better on standardized testing.
Okay.
Okay, well, hold on. Wait. I want to address what was just said. So,
You can, right?
Thank you,
After you're
thank
done, however, I want to kind of derail this train a
Repivot.
little bit with a
Sure.
question for the panel, but respond, please.
I just think it's funny how we went from like, oh, like black students, they're just like go to underfunded schools. They don't have access to money resources. And then when I show that they do, well, they need those resources.
You did not show that.
Well, I posted it. I'm not necessarily saying that they don't need
The
those
same
resources.
source,
Hold on.
the same source
I'm
shows
not-
the
I'm
exact
not-
systemic issue we're pointing to.
Okay, I'm not necessarily saying that they don't need those extra resources, but when you look at the extra resources they get from the federal
They get
government,
$100 more per
it's
student,
$100
and you
more.
haven't outlined whether that's for food or education. If you look at
Right.
instructional
The
costs,
article shows it.
I know it shows that as black student percentages increase, there is less money spent on instructional values. That's what that's showing, which means that
So-
the gap between black and white students might be better explained by things like paying for lunch meals.
Okay,
Like
two things.
subsidized
No.
lunches.
So that number it actually is broken down by tuition, lesson plans, other things. It's true that when you break it down specifically, now about half the cost of the education, a little bit more than half the cost, is focused on like teacher salaries. When you break it down by that, which the article I posted does, you see that yes, white students per capita get slightly more. It's true. It's about $100, right? So overall, black students get $100 more in total resources because white students require less disciplinary resources on total. They overall more than slightly, a statistically insignificant more amount of that money is going towards instruction specifically. But I overall, again, you have black students getting more resources than white students. I think it's fascinating how we moved on from they're not to, well, they need it. I'm not even necessarily denying that they need it. And the zip code thing, first of all, that's irrelevant to the fact that the federal government is stepping in and making sure that poor zip codes are getting more money than otherwise. But also, I know we don't want to make this like partisan or whatever, but who's the people that are opposing school choice? Who are the people that are saying that you shouldn't be able to leave your zip code? It's not the Republicans.
Okay.
I don't know if we want to get to like
I don't know if
about the
that's
charter
true.
system because like
It
that
kinda
is so
is.
wrong. I know you like some of you aren't even from the United States, but the
That's
idea that like we open up charter school and then everybody goes to the megatopolis 20,000 school while every other school has to rot, ignoring the
Yeah.
fact that if you're poor, you probably can't drive your kid an hour to go to the charter school halfway across the town.
Fucking facts.
You get busing.
This is a
If you
can of
can't afford
worms.
to drive your student, you get a school bus.
Fucking city of
Charter-
Los Angeles.
charter
So
school-
right now in America, you
Just
get a
real
school
quick.
bus
That's
if
what
you
we
can't
do.
drive your kid to
Stop.
work.
Charter-
That's what we do in Canada. Just to be
Should I
clear,
be
that's a
able
good
to-
idea. We do that in Canada.
We
have
do
buses
that
go-
here.
So Aaron,
private-
in here,
the private
in here
school
for
that I
charter
went to.
schools-
The private
Yeah,
school
so-
that I went to would bus kids for an hour and a half to get there.
Yes, in America, we
Just to be
bus
clear,
kids.
That's
Yes.
probably not that feasible, though. I think it's better to just better fund the schools that they live near.
We fund them disproportionately.
No,
I
we
don't know-
don't. No,
Well-
you're saying funding from federal dollars, not
I've
from
got a
property
few
taxes.
things.
Who
Those
cares
federal
where the
dollars
money
are to
comes from?
compensate
Who cares where the money
property
comes
If it's
from?
okay for
It's
me
money.
to-
No,
A
no,
dollar
no,
is
no,
a
no,
dollar.
no. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
When I go to the
agree.
dollar
I agree.
store, the
But I'm
dollar
saying
store doesn't
there's a-
ask me,
Oh
did
my
this
God.
dollar come from the federal government or did
Nope.
it come from
No,
the
no,
local
no,
property
no.
taxes?
Lactoid, you're purposely misunderstanding my argument. I'm saying there is a deficit here from property taxes, and then the federal government fills it here. There's still that little gap.
Wait.
Look at
More
that
than fills
positive.
it. More than fills it.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
I posted
Because
the
showed-
link. It's
It's time-
$100.
it's time
I
to
showed
put
a
on
source
that.
right here that showed it's
Y'all
should
2,200,
feel
and
my-
your source
okay.
showed like 500 per
What?
student. $500 per student versus $2,200 per student.
I'm gonna read.
As far
I'm
as I
gonna
can
read
see.
off my
Now, I wanna
fucking
be-
source.
I wanna be
This is
clear.
literally average expenditures by race. This is right off my source. The average black student attends a district that spends $14,385 per student, while the average white student attends a district that spends
Scroll
$14,293.
down. Just scroll down. I'll continue
Yeah.
reading your
Can
source. There's
I-
a small but statistically significant negative relationship. On average, schools with a 10% higher share of black students spend $140 less per student on instruction.
Yes.
The data on total expenditures
Yes.
are similar, but schools with a higher 10%
Correct.
higher share of black students spend $160
Yes.
less per
And
student.
do you know why? Do you know why? Because the article explains why. Because that little chunk, along with all the money extra that is being spent on extra additional school resources. For example, for emotional and behavioral problems, right?
Oh,
They're
so you're
literally
making our
addressing
argument.
the
Great.
primarily problems that are happening there.
So is it okay?
And by the way, this is $160
Let me ask.
out of
Stop.
$14,000.
Okay, enough.
We gotta let this in.
Enough. Okay, I'm gonna try to derail this train a little bit,
True.
right?
True.
Given the fact, right, that there are inequalities, right, in performances, right, between zip codes, as Erudite put it. Some students from certain zip codes just do poorer, right? They do poorly on standardized tests, etc. Are standardized tests the way to go when it comes to admissions? There's been arguments about eliminating standardized tests. What do we think of that, gang?
I think standardized tests, depending on them, typically don't map on super well to like GPA, for example, is a much better predictor of success. This is why actually, like in psychology, almost all clinical psych schools across the country are basically doing away with a standardized test called the GRE, because standardized test scores are actually pretty bad for mapping onto like actual student capability, because an hour to like determine 50% of your grade, some people who are high anxiety will crack, and then you're going to lose out on all those high potentials who can actually do a very steady, consistent amount of like high quality work.
University of California actually they got rid of ACT and SATs for enrollment, so that's actually going to be like a really interesting experiment in the next couple of years. So obviously it's a little weird, I think, with standardized testing because of COVID pandemic and how that has like absolutely like shocked the education system. But yeah, I think in like the next 5 or 10 years we'll actually have some pretty good data as to like how those enrollment things change. Yeah.
So again, this is evidence. Is easy. You can look it up on Google. First couple results.
Is that where you
but
look things up?
Yeah, I normally look things up on Google, and then once I
Pretty useful
find,
tool.
yeah, it's pretty useful. So SATs are predictive of success. The LSAT, for example, for law schools, the thing that I took, that is actually more predictive of success for law schools than GPA is for undergraduate. So yes, I think these, and the only reason why people are upset about these standardized tests and why they're upset about GPA as well, by the way, is because they don't like the results. They don't like the fact that certain racial demographics are performing better, like Asians are performing better on these tests and performing better in GPA than other racial demographics that they want in these colleges. That's what's happening.
Really, really weird. I used that tool that you told me about, Google, and it said that that a study finds high school GPAs outweigh ACTs for college readiness.
So
is it-
SATs typically only add about a 15% predictive power, which, by the way, is not that much.
And
So
GPAs are
it's cool to know that LSATs are
much better.
great. I'm not saying that there are 0 standardized tests that aren't good for workplaces, but I am saying, for example, the GRE was for clinical psych was basically useless. I think it added like a 1% predictive value over top of GPA. And so the issue is that SAT scores are something that are massively influenced by things that are time sensitive, like mood disorders and stuff like that. And so you're massively impacting somebody's potential based on like a blip of like a couple of like weeks of like depression or anxiety or something like that.
I think 15% is significant. I'm
Yeah,
not
but
gonna.
it's
I'm not gonna.
as significant as GPAs.
Well, look, I agree with you that GPA is important, right? GPA is very important. But if we look at GPAs in the context of the affirmative action discussion, I'm also right. When you look at the average GPAs of entering students by racial demographic, when you look at Harvard's data, when you look at the data of other schools, right, it's like just as strong of like, wow, this disparity in GPAs by race of student admits. And when you look at standardized tests, you also see a massive disparity as well.
Why?
I don't.
Lactoid. I'm curious. Why do you think that there's this disparity among racial lines between GPA and SAT and all these other kind of metrics that we use? Why do you think that there is a difference, as you assert that there is, between Asians and other races?
So all I know is that there is, in terms of speculating as to a cause, there's all sorts of speculations. Some people speculate that it's due to underlying deep and systemic racism and issues that have induced certain demographics to not want to strive as much. That could be true. It also could be true that certain cultures, especially Asian cultures, and if you've ever hung out with a Korean person, you know what I'm talking about, have an incredibly strong emphasis on success, where you have to be good, otherwise you're going to disappoint your entire family. And then if you have that culture, which is you got to fucking study every night, otherwise your parents are going to be pissed as fuck, is it really that much of a surprise that these students tend to be very, very good, as opposed to maybe a culture where if you're talking like too articulately, like your community yells at you for acting too white, maybe that has like one culture maybe has like more of like a propensity towards success than the other one. I don't know.
Specifically in East Asia, for example, they have standardized tests, I think, just to get into like the high school levels. And it's very much based on that. There's a less of a holistic approach. So I know in those cultures, it's not just like, oh, wow, we really want our kids to be smart, but they're used to that. Like, you have to do well on your tests. You have to study every day for it. If you don't, you're basically fucked as far as your education goes.
I will agree that a lot of Eastern Asian culture has like a super like hyper focus on discipline and being studious and all that stuff. Okay. Do you think so? So is your speculation though regarding this disparity between like racial performance in schools? Is it entirely cultural? There's no other contributing factors?
My speculation is that it's primarily cultural, and that it's also very, very strongly associated with the single motherhood rate, which has been consistently linked to academic underperformance. And Black people, on average, like more than half of Black people grow up in a household, in a single mother household, while Asians has one of the lowest rates.
Okay, I want to give space.
I don't disagree.
Just real quick, I want to give space to Lucy. I know they're having trouble getting in. Lucy, just for the future, just elbow your way in here, right? So feel free, right? But go on.
So I do think that it, rather than culturally, just goes back to the fact that certain people from certain communities just don't have as much opportunity, that they are pigeonholed into places that are underfunded. I do have a few things here about the underfunding of schools, that the property value is lowered by the fact that the schools are, and that even the people are not performing well, that we don't even take into consideration that people from poor neighborhoods might not be able to do the things that more wealthy people will have access to, because when it comes to college admission in the US, it's not just a matter of doing well on the tests, it's a matter of several soft things that you can add up to get a really high score. Like, it's the system in that regard is very different from Poland. In Poland, you just, let's say you want to be a psychometrician, right? So you say, I will study psychology, so I just have to pass biology, Polish, and I think chemistry at the end of high school. And if I get enough of a high score from these, I get in. And in the US, it's you have to do an essay, you have to do extra activity. For some schools, if your parent was in the school, then you get a few extra points. For some school, if you are from a certain state, you get some extra points.
And
So it's
yes,
a bit more
but this only
involved
applies, just real
than-
quick, this only applies to higher end colleges. If you went into a college, a community college or something like that, it's the standards
Well, I
are
assume we're
much
speaking
different.
of university level, right?
Yeah. Also, if you were to just do it standardized by GPA, Asians and white people would absolutely crush blacks and Hispanics. That's not really
It
like
would
a
not be
solution.
close.
Yeah, it's like the
Yes,
difference
but
is like
the
huge.
question is,
Quite.
because affirmative action is supposed to help those who do not have certain opportunities because of their circumstances of where they were born, who are eager to learn, to be given that chance.
Can I ask, would you guys be in favor of, let's say, black government employees getting, like, I don't know, 2/3 more money, like in their salary, in order to like help alleviate the systemic disparities in pay between black people and white people? That, like, for the same job, like, black people just get paid more.
I don't think I necessarily would, but legitimately, if we're talking about poor communities and I don't know. I would have to think about someone who worked remotely, lived in a poor community for a rich job, if they should get paid more. I don't know. But the
No,
answer
but based on race, So the government,
Yeah,
like,
well,
okay, you're
I've
a black
conceded-
person, so your
I've
pay is
conceded-
$100K for a job that a white person would get paid at
I've conceded
30K.
quite a while ago that I would much rather be focusing on income than race. Because I think that reparations that is based off of race and not income is just it's the improper place to start.
It's improper place to start.
Yeah, we should be focusing on income. I don't know how I worded it. I might have.
So you would prefer government jobs actually pay black applicants more?
No, not black.
Affirmative. Okay. You base it off poverty, not anything.
That's what I'm saying. Is that is something that I would be interested in, and actually, that's the first time I heard it. I would have to dig in a little bit. I might be interested in it.
Yeah, the cool thing about income is it actually like benefits white people. So, all the old conservatives that are like 60, 70 that actually are racist and that's why they hate it. Like,
well, there
actually does
are
help them a
actually
lot.
certain things in place for getting extra points that do take into consideration states that are very low income and primarily white.
Here's the reality with like all this low income and everything. The reality is that like the early formative years of your life are going to be almost the like necessary precursors. So Head Start is probably the only affirmative action program that I'm at this point wholly and completely behind, because it seems to be the case that when students start behind, they stay behind. And this isn't even mitigated by like greater parental involvement. Low SES kids that have improved parental involvement didn't actually catch up to their peers that were higher SES. There's this unfortunate, uncomfortable reality, which is that like poverty tends to beget poverty. And there's a number of complicated factors for this. I think think it's a number of like systemic issues. IQ gating is one of the biggest things that our society doesn't really talk about. And I don't mean this at a race realist level. I'm talking about this exclusive ed and education. I think your guys' zip codes for education is fucking insane. I have no understanding of why that is. I don't fully understand the details, but like with both zip coding and a history of redlining, I don't know why anyone is shocked that people of color are behind on education. Fucking of course. It's not even shocking to me at all. The issue is that how do we actually address the educational inequality? That's the question that I want to say.
Let me. Yeah. So you just said that parental involvement is more predictive, and in fact, students with more parental involvement actually outdo their peers that have higher SES.
No, I said the
No?
opposite. So that's
if you're at higher SES, even if your parents so a single motherhood family with higher SES is actually more an advantage than like a two-parent household with lower SES.
That was shocking to me as well. And I'll need more studies. Again, these are studies that are hard to come by, but there was a really interesting study that I found that was a 12-year follow-up study that looked at basically high and low SES with a number of factors. And between those 2 years, parental involvement, particularly in the low SES, jumped up dramatically. And yet we didn't actually see any narrowing of the gaps of SES performance, because it seems to be the case that if you like start off slow, if you have like pretty crappy like daycare policies, one thing that's really interesting is the amount of words that you're exposed to in the first 4 years of your life are a massive predictor of your like later on success. So like even if you just go to a daycare that's less funded and therefore has crappier quality daycare workers who are maybe less educated and using less interesting words and talking about less interesting ideas, you're just already somewhat set up worse than anybody else.
I'll look into that.
Keep in mind that the vocabulary.
We can send you the study. It's really interesting.
Like the vocabulary thing will affect the essay that you need to write for the admission, so that will be a huge factor probably as well. But
she probably just means intelligence, like in public school, performance in public school.
Then let me ask.
Yeah, and I do want to
just real quick before you address that, because this brings up an interesting question for me, right?
Yeah.
Is it the responsibility of people who have been well educated, who have been successful, right, who have been able to, they were privileged, but let's be clear, because of the results of their birth and where they were born and how their upbringing, should they lose out on their college opportunity because we need to put in people with less privilege that perform poorer? But is it like, should the rich or the privileged have to sacrifice their spot or the spot of their child into these places? And again, we can say that, ideally that wouldn't happen, but it is a case in the ground, at least in America, where there are limited opportunities in these especially prestigious colleges where it actually does matter. Like the difference between being a lawyer from Harvard and a lawyer from 𝕵𝖔𝖎𝑻 is massive, right?
Actually,
but I don't. Yeah. Okay, so one. Sorry, I was going to respond to 𝙎𝙪𝙗𝙧, but then I also want to respond to Wick. So I'll go two pieces. But one, I 100% agree with 𝙎𝙪𝙗 said about how this begins at an early stage, and I think there are way more interesting policies that I would advocate way before it. Like I said in my own opening statement, way before I would talk about affirmative action, which feels like at the very end. Of what like the very end of the life stage of the discrimination that we're talking about, where we start addressing it. Like I would love to be talking about like negative income taxes, zoning deregulation, whatever. But to address Wick's point, sorry, Wick, so so the difference between a lawyer from Harvard and a lawyer at 𝕵𝖫𝖎, first off, let's say that this like extremely rich white person, like higher class, someone who's not prioritized on college education. The idea that he's going to go to 𝕵𝖫𝖎 is probably inaccurate, but I do think that the difference between Harvard and 𝕵𝖫𝖎 and 𝕵𝖫𝖎 and no education, there is a way larger gap between the latter rather than the former. So that, yes, I will concede. Yes, I do.
Especially
think
if you
that they
escape.
should.
Like, especially if you escape like law schools and these like certain ones, like I know law school does pull from like Ivy Leagues a lot more, but like just in general, going to like any community college gives you such a massive economic benefit that like I don't see why the focus should be getting people into college as opposed to like getting them into top colleges. If you're a poor person and you go to any community college, you are massively changing your income.
So, Yeah.
You mean the difference between no college and some colleges?
Lucy, you
Yeah,
just
like-
gotta
like-
go.
Yeah.
We
Like, for
paused for
example,
so
like,
long.
like, like, a,
One.
like a bachelor's from
So,
UCLA and a bachelor's from a community. It's not like that's not that significant, right?
Go, Lucy, go.
It really does not seem like it follows. When it comes to the affirmative action students that come in, for them it's sort of like a chance at education, period. But for other people, even if a person does not get to a university, usually from my experience, people have at least 3 universities of choice. So worst case scenario, they will either go to university number 2 or 3. It does not delete their chances at education. It does not destroy their life. And if they are really set at getting to a very particular university, and that is a thing that is practiced in Poland quite often, if a person does not get into a university, they go to a different university and then transfer to the university that they do want to learn at. So there's this scarcity argument that people's lives are being ruined by affirmative action, and I'm not sure I see it.
Well, could you just apply the argument the other way around, that if you are, a underrepresented minority group, you don't have the, credentials to get into Harvard or Yale or Princeton, you go to a community college for 2 years and then
Well,
transfer to a better.
The question
public
is
school.
if most affirmative action students aim at Harvard, Yale, etc.
Well, that's what we're specifically talking about. We're talking about a lawsuit at Harvard, so.
I guess one thing that would be interesting to know is, do like all universities have affirmative action? Is it localized more around like upperly mobile? Is
Well,
affirmative action advocates more fixated on Ivy Leagues versus like
The-
other universities?
I think
the
what they're able to
problem
get
in
away
the
with depends
US
on the
is that
state.
it depends on the state, and it also can depend on the school, because the schools implement different rules of admission around, like
Yeah,
how
all that's
points are
obvious.
distributed. So
I know.
well,
I'm
I
counting that into
mean,
my
it's
question.
obvious for the US, but for example, for other countries, not necessarily. The other country has more standardized sort of.
Yeah, but we're talking about American universities
Yeah,
for
yeah,
affirmative action. So in the case of American, I'm just asking. I don't know if anyone on the panel knows. Does anybody know? Like, do almost all universities have some form of affirmative action policy, or is it specifically? And do the advocates fixate mostly on Ivy Leagues?
So as I understand it, there are some colleges who will say, like Harvard had to give their data. They will say they give points based on like racial preferences, but most colleges won't admit they do, right? And they'll use other metrics that.
My
It's also
understanding
it's banned in 10 states. I think there's 10
Actually,
states
I'm not
that have
gonna-
tried it.
California bans it, right?
I don't know
Yeah,
anyone
California has it, but keep in mind that in California,
usually-
it's only for schools that are like funded by the federal. So I think Stanford, for example, they're still allowed to discriminate by race because they don't
Berkeley
accept,
also
like,
has
state
affirmative
funding.
action policy.
No, they
I
don't.
was-
No, they don't.
yes,
The
so
entire
Mine-
University of California system does not have. It's not allowed.
No, so
Mine
they don't have
because-
quotas. Just to be clear, I was looking
No,
into
no, no.
Berkeley
It's not.
specifically.
It's not quotas. Quotas
quotas are
came out in
illegal.
1978.
Let me finish my statement
Sorry.
and you'll understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's quotas. It's obviously not quotas. Those are banned. What I'm saying is that Berkeley specifically is known to have certain affirmative action policies, because there was another case in UC. It was against UC Berkeley by another student. I can't remember the name of the case. I apologize, but it was talking about specifically an affirmative action policy where it wasn't quotas, but they were specifically giving some level of preference of, basically it was under their diversity wing, and they were interested in diversity. And if you had like diverse experiences, and they listed a number of things, including both sex and race, that would be used in conjunction to understand your application. And so this is the actual forms of affirmative action that most people are concerned about.
Gotcha.
Oh,
So
this
what you're
is
describing is the University of California versus 𝕵𝖎, which was 1978.
No,
That's where they got
that's
rid
not
of
what I'm
quotas.
talking about.
Okay.
That's not what I'm talking about.
Wait,
In
wait, 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 wait.
1986, California
I know
passed
this.
Prop 209, which prohibited UC and other state entities from using race, ethnicity, or sex as a criteria. This is why California doesn't have any sort of race-based discrimination when it comes to their university.
Okay, I guess I'll go look it up. I'm not talking about 𝕵𝖎,
So-
obviously. I'm aware of
so-
𝕵𝖎.
Okay.
That's what
Well,
standard.
there's also-
Because that's what got rid of quotas. That's why I was.
Wait, 𝕵𝖎's
I'm not
Sounds like
talking
you're
about quotas.
Okay.
𝕵𝖎 got rid of quotas, but in 1996, yes, California did.
𝙬╠ versus
by-
Bollinger
by-
is a good example of one where affirmative action was standed by the Supreme Court.
So this is different, right? So in California, so the Supreme Court has consistently held that states can ban affirmative action if they want to, and California did. In 1996, there was a referendum that removed race-based affirmative action from public colleges, with a caveat, which is that California is one of these fucking states where the admissions programs, they don't say it. They don't say we're going to give you points because you're black. But they just tend to rate certain minorities as more dynamic,
Yes,
more
thank you.
more
That's what I'm
exciting,
talking about. Yes.
more with more pizzazz.
1996 California Proposition 209. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
that's the one I've been talking about the whole time, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Not
So California does do that. There's a lot of colleges there that basically hide the fact that they're doing it, but they do it in one way or
Yes.
another. But they can't explicitly do it though.
No,
California is
but
one of the
they-
states where they can't say like, "Oh, you're black, therefore we're going to give you some points based on that." They cannot do
Well,
that.
So the
That is-
I mean, yeah, if we're
2003
talking about, like, things
Grutter.
going under the table, then
It's
sure.
under
No,
the
no,
table,
it's not. It's
and
not.
they do.
It's not entirely under table. The Router-Brolinger case is what set the precedent of how we tend to implement these things. Where in this case, there was a law school in Michigan that basically tailored to match diversity was found to be fair, and race was allowed to be considered within admissions, but it was under like these new types of languages versus the old ones of just explicitly being about race. And so, like most universities have adopted policies that are similar to the University of Michigan, including multiple different universities.
Wait. So that was Grutter was 2003. In 2000, hold on. In 2006, Michigan banned all affirmative action by statute. So
Yeah.
Grutter doesn't apply anymore to Michigan because they
No,
banned it
I
by
didn't say that
statute.
it did. I said that the Grutter policy, because it was upheld by the Supreme Court, was then taken by a number of universities and they went, "Oh fuck, that works," and was then adopted and disseminated out. That's
But not
what
California though.
Right,
So
but
it was
also-
adopted by a number of other states, but not California and not Michigan, because both those states explicitly banned it, but implicitly they're absolutely doing it under the table. There's no doubt about that whatsoever.
Yeah, and like I think that's like something that
Right.
like I don't know if we could ever get
But-
rid of again, unless we got rid of like names too. If you see that somebody's name is Kim Early, you know that they're going to be Asian, right? So,
like I've been given.
Well, but maybe they're more dynamic. Who knows?
oh, yeah, maybe.
Like, because we have two actually important things when it comes to admission. We have admission itself. So, are you able to study here? Are you able to attend this place? And the second important factor, which I'm not sure we've touched upon, are you actually going to receive the funding to be able to be here? And there was a university, and I don't know if it was Harvard or which was it, that has decided to basically give funding only to very poor people. And if a person, even if it was a person of color, had an income that was above very poor, then they would not fund the whole course.
Are we talking about access to scholarships and things like that?
Yes,
Access to
because
to
being
let me ask.
being admitted to a school is
I
one
understand.
thing,
If you
but
can't afford
actually
it, you
getting
can't
the
go. I
funding,
get it.
yeah.
Yeah. But that brings up a question, right? Given the fact, right, that there are so many scholarships, or I guess I'll ask it rather than just assert it. Do minorities have more access to scholarships than, say, you or I? I don't actually know.
It
Or
depends.
is it more of the fact
Scholarships,
that
I would guess absolutely, yeah.
I would-
But
I would
couldn't
think
or,
say.
so.
or access to grants, loans, etc. Right?
There are just tons and tons of options for scholarships,
Mhm.
like especially depending on the state you live with. There's just like hundreds of different
It's
like
not
routes you
even
could go.
close.
Well, like
I
no,
would-
specific to you, there are probably hundreds of different
Okay.
options you could go for. But the numbers obviously like in the thousands of like things you have access to apply for, and obviously there would be more options for minorities. Yes.
Yes, there are, and I got some scholarships when I went to school. That's absolutely true. I mean, they obviously none of them were race-based scholarships. If you just
Right.
look at
You
them.
don't have access
Right.
to that. Yeah.
I don't have access to those, but there was a fuck ton that I didn't have access to, and I think this is pretty.
One of
My
the big
understanding
things-
though is that when I quickly looked it up because I wasn't sure, because that would be my assumption too, is that there's more. But 71% of white students receive scholarships, while minorities win about 28.5%. So maybe there are more of them available, but I guess like they're never
It
being
could be
applied
Or
for.
different
Or
types of scholarships. Yeah. like
Yeah,
ones
because
that-
it could be that like there's like military sponsorship or scholarships, and those
Right.
might go more towards white students, so it might actually balance
military.
itself out.
You mean like the Pell Grant or?
Right.
I just assume that there's
Okay.
scholarships
Okay,
for
so
military. no?
well, if you go to the
There might
military,
not
you
be,
get your
like-
college paid for through the Pell Grant. I think.
No,
it's-
I'm saying if you're like father's in the military.
Oh, if you're in a military family, maybe $5 for
I
Meatwad.
just
$5 for Meatwad to say legacy admissions are affirmative action for rich people. Fair enough.
Haze, I was going to bring up
Wait.
admissions.
Wait. No. I got a number of things to
I
say.
was going to say, I know that you're going to be prepped for
Oh.
legacy admissions, so
No,
I feel like that's
I got
that's
so
necessary
I got
to
so
tackle.
many. I got so many things to say. Okay, first of all, something that was said just didn't make sense to me. So I looked into it, right? So no, a higher percentage of Black people,
Okay,
88%, compared to
bring
white
up,
people, only
yeah.
74%, got any kind of grant or federal aid from the government, non-repayable. Okay, so Black people get more from the government. And then when you look at Caucasian students receive 72% of all scholarships, Caucasian students receive 72% of all scholarships. Minority students receive only 28% of all scholarships. Now, read that carefully. That does not mean that Black people are underrepresented in getting scholarships, because they are a much smaller percentage of people who go to college,
obviously.
right? So,
Sure.
so they are actually an outsized percentage of people who get
But,
scholarships compared to white
So they're
students.
higher
And-
proportionally. Is what
Right,
you're
right.
And
Yeah, absolutely, it's a high proportion. They get more scholarships. And then as to the legacy point, I do not deny whatsoever that legacy absolutely has a pro-white lean, because of course people in the past who went to those colleges are more likely to be white.
Not just more
Therefore,
likely you're allowed to, just to be clear.
absolutely. Look, like I'm not denying that. But
Well, isn't it admission based on immutable characteristics? Isn't that the problem?
yeah, so back then there was absolutely, they banned certain people from going to the school based on whether or not they were, Jewish or Black or
Well, no,
anything.
they're
Yeah,
giving an
absolutely.
immutable benefit to people just because of who their parents are.
Correct.
You're going to get looked at more
to be
favorably.
clear, absolutely, and to be clear, I'm against legacy. I think, by the way, I think any and all things that shit on merit are like stupid. I think merit is like the ultimate thing, because at the end of the day, who do you want building your plane? The affirmative action hire, or the person
What
who
about
like
summary?
did the best?
the
But
question is,
or
what do you
summaries,
mean
right?
by merit?
Well, I wanted to say one last thing. When you look at the legacy, it's true this has an effect, but the Harvard data that was released shows that, like, even when you control for legacy, if you removed all race-based affirmative action and removed legacy with it, you would see the proportion of white students go up, right?
Also, one of the things that makes
legacy is such
like
a
really
small percentage.
Yeah, one of the things that makes legacy really difficult is that it does have an insanely high correlation to getting into, like your parents' alma mater or whatever. But when they actually looked, like, parents, like, if you had a Harvard legacy, you were also getting into Yale and Princeton and Stanford at significantly higher rates, because you're just in an environment, like, if your parents went to Harvard, you're going to.
This is about the systemic stuff, right? So, like,
so
there's a piece
tricky,
of. So the piece of legacy that's tricky is the systemic and element of, like, schools are probably going to look more favorably on legacies because they're probably grown up in education settings that are going to, like, prepon them more. But this is going to be the exact same inverse argument for why they're, like, might be need to consider, like, Black individuals and, like, how they are disproportionately undereducated and have worse education opportunities, and therefore their GPA may not be reflective of their potential but of their poor education, particularly the SATs.
Question
as someone
specifically.
who's so interested in a meritocratic society, it's interesting.
You don't? Are you not
agree.
interested in a meritocratic? I had a question for Lactoid, but I have a question for you. Staxiums, do you?
No,
not
I
think merit
100%.
is a
No,
good
I'm 100% interested in a meritocracy, and I'm just saying, hey, if we want to address systemic issues, that's how we do so. And I'm saying Lactoid says he's interested in a meritocracy, but it seems like when addressing these sort of systemic issues at the root, or acknowledging that there are some absolutely historical examples where they are still being passed on intergenerationally, because we know that intergenerational wealth exists, and that wealth is a predictor for high education. Like, finding a way to probably, like, have a more meritocratic system is a positive. Would you not? Would you not agree?
Right. So
That was a question towards Lactoid.
Well, it depends how you define merit, right? So there's two schools of thought. The one school of thought is, at the end of the day, who can do the job better? That's one way of defining merit. The other way of defining merit is, if we control for everything throughout this person's life, who do we think could potentially have done better? The second one, I think, is very nebulous and speculative, although I'm in favor of, I guess, everyone being the best person they can be. At the end of the day, especially if I'm, like, getting, like I don't want to feel like, while I'm on the sub that's collapsed, like, okay, maybe too soon for that. Okay, hold on. That's too soon for that. I'm not going to use it.
Hey,
Maybe. No. 5 people died. It's wrong. Hold on. It's 5 people wrong. 5 people died. I don't want to bring it up, right? But, like, let's say you're on a plane and, like, the wings start falling off. Like, the last thought in my head was, well, at least somebody who got a chance who otherwise may have been like not been able to do that. No, I want like
Well,
I want the
think
firms
Wait, dude,
hiring the
that's
best
so
people.
This is
nonsense.
the
Wait,
myth.
hold-
This
can
is
I-
the myth of meritocracy in general. It's like
Right.
meritocracy to some degree is valuable. Of like, yeah, we want more qualified people in positions that take higher level technical skill. But meritocracy is a massive myth as soon as we get to individuals, because most individuals, even at really high levels, are decently replaceable because there are millions of people who are similarly level of skilled and would be able to have the capacity to do your jobs outside of even GPA. Absolutely, this is true, right? So many jobs are going to be replaceable. Some jobs are going to be harder to replace, but absolutely, there are going to be people who can fill your shoes. This is self-evident.
There's-
How hiring practices are reliant on in marriage parties, that you're never fully so valuable that the firm can't fight.
No,
it.
but
There's-
similarly is pulling a ton of weight
Okay,
in that sentence,
so-
right? There's no such thing as like qualified and unqualified. Qualification is a spectrum, and I'd prefer a situation in which if I'm an employer, I can accurately predict what level of quality that I'm selecting in a candidate without having to
Accurate.
accurate.
It seems like
Accurate
a
is the
spectrum,
biggest
so that's
issue.
the
without
problem.
without
You'd
having
have
to without having to compensate for like, oh, this person's here because of XYZ non-skill based reasons.
So the
Which is what
issue,
affirmative action does.
That's
the
the
issue-
problem.
the issue is that we conflate all these things, right?
Not
This is
exactly true.
this is why we have PhD conflations. Like, this is why you can find a PhD to say fucking everything, right? Because like the reality, okay, the reality is that GPAs are super valuable, but GPAs are also extremely going to be underserving at a number of fields about whether or not they're meritable. This is why, for example, in the help field, it is like the classic meme that everyone prefers like the master's student who just got like an average counseling degree versus the people with the PhD clinical psych degrees, because the PhDs are fucking stupid with people. Because yeah, they're really good at school and smarts, but they're terrible at talking to people, and they're terrible at like negotiating like human management, which is what, by the way, human management is essential to most jobs nowadays. There are some highly technical jobs for like our antisocial weirdos that can go and not talk to people, but there are increasingly high human management roles
So
that GPA is not a good explanation for.
But that's not based on race, right? I don't agree
don't
that
think-
like
yeah,
fucking
sure.
black people have more dynamism. I think that people of all races, I think if you like somebody in an interview, I agree that's going to be much more determinative of whether or not you hire them. But that's still like a factor, right? That's still like a relevant factor, like how well you work with people.
But race actually can be a merit. I know that, like for doctors, for example, people tend to actually respond a lot better and take advice from physicians that are the same race as them. Which is why I know, in like it's actually weird because I know med schools do really want diverse people coming in, because otherwise they're not actually graduating enough like diversity in their doctors.
I believe
I'm gonna
that
let Lucy.
I believe that the whole meritocracy argument is pretty deceptive, as we are talking about people that might have the skill, for example, might have the drive and might have the merit, but might have the tools to do their best before going to college. And I think we can throw away the doing the best job example, because we're not talking about jobs, we're talking about educating people to do the best possible job. And there is existing data. There are actually examples of schools that do not, because when we're talking about affirmative action, we're not just talking about a single step of admitting people. We're actually also talking about the support that goes afterwards, both psychological help to the students and additional help that would help them overcome the hurdles that they had before, that would enable them to have a equal playing field with other people that had more means. Like, for example, if we're talking about essays, is it more, does a person that has access to tutors that would practically just teach them the exact skill on how to write essays, is that merit?
Yes, because now they know how to write essays.
No, it's not merit.
Wait,
it's
wait, wait,
based
wait.
on
Because they can do the job. If someone
tuition.
teaches, no, if someone
Wait,
teaches
hold on,
you,
hold on.
wait. If somebody teaches you how to fucking like blacksmith, and now you can blacksmith, and some other guy's like, well, I
This
could have
is not like blacksmithing.
I could have.
Wait, wait,
No, hold on. I could have been a
I'd like to-
blacksmith
No,
if I
Lucy's
wasn't.
just right here.
If I didn't grow up in the
You
You
fucking
cannot compare
in an environment with a lack of anvils.
essays.
I would
Look,
like
it
to
doesn't,
respond.
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Wait. It doesn't matter, right? Like, at the end of the
Yes, it
day,
does.
when I'm going in to get a fucking like pair of pliers made. Okay,
Nobody's
I don't
talking
give a fuck.
trade schools.
I don't give a
Lucy's
okay.
talking
Wait.
about like philosophical.
It's all the
capacity
same.
for
It's all the
generation.
same.
No, it's not.
Yes,
It's
it is.
not. There's
The
no
lawyers,
world.
the lawyers who were
There's
who
no
were
world that you're
ushered
going to
in,
argue.
the lawyers who were ushered in because of their race, they were quite literally given a benefit, which very well could have and probably did in most cases make up for a lack of skill. And that is critically important when you're the one on trial.
Point out
Just
some
to be clear,
hypocrisy.
essays are the worst example of just like simple skill and merit. Essays are objectively the stupidest like thing to argue with. Lucy's right here. Essays are so deeply subjectively based. It's not like a blacksmith teaching somebody how to build a nail or a horseshoe. Essays are subjectively marked. They're subjectively determined about what is good. For example, there are tons of famous essayists that at the time of their writing, everyone scoffed at because their prose was shit. And now we look at them and we look at the ideas that they're putting forward and we
Right.
call them brilliant. So
It'd
Lucy,
be better if they knew better prose. And on average, the
And
people who knew better prose were probably
not-
better than the people who didn't. You
based
can
on
have
the-
you can have diamonds in the rough. I don't disagree with that. But at the end of the day, even when it comes to essays or when it comes to any kind of practice, any kind of skill, or when it comes to motions, which you're filing in court, that's also like maybe not quite an essay, but kind of similar in the
First
sense
of
of
all,
your
everything
in the sense of you got a thesis and you're making an argument. Your skill matters
all
there.
these things can be
Wait.
done by ChatGPT at this point. Just structure.
No,
and
they can't. This fucking lawyer
Stop.
tried that
Let
and
me
he's
stop for,
getting
like,
it
2
fucking
seconds.
disbarred
Can I agree?
because he
And
fucking didn't
ChatGPT
check his
is actually
citation.
becoming
Okay,
an
enough.
problem
Enough.
with us, but-
Enough.
Can I go?
Enough.
No, wait,
there-
why have
everyone-
merit because the
everyone
robots will
stop.
replace us? Is that your argument?
Everyone stop because I
I
can't
can't
hear
hear
anyone. Everyone stop or you will be stopped. Everyone, that includes you, Lucy. Okay, $5 from 𝕵𝖎𝖎𝖙𝑘𝑍𝑔𝑜 to say this. If workplaces are urged to look at resumes during the hiring process, shouldn't schools? Can you put people's names on screen? I only know a few of them. Yeah, I'll do them. There's Doubleshine, Kilo, Lactoid, Lucy, NotSoErudite, and Staxiums. On the merit argument of things, right? We seem to be kind of getting we're diverging. We're missing each other, I feel. At the end of the day, it does matter. This is my opinion. I'll share this. Your drive, your work ethic, all this does matter. But at the end of the day, also, regardless of how hard you try or how hard I try, I'm never going to be as good as volleyball as someone who's 6'8". I'm just never going to. I'm not. It's impossible for me, right? No matter how hard I try, no matter what tools are given me, they are just going to be objectively better, right? And there are some people, like it or not, who, no matter how hard you try, you will never be as smart as. They're just going to be objectively smarter than you. It's just true.
Right.
And
Be
I
it
think
as
that
it-
these two ideas are kind of at odds right now. That a lot of you are arguing, well, yes, drive matters. You need tools so you can access your full potential. But what Lactoid seems to be arguing is that at the end of the day, this person's full potential is just always going to be higher than yours. $5 more from 𝕵𝖎𝖎𝖙𝑘𝑍𝑔𝑜 to say I didn't write the question right. Workplaces look at nameless resumes, shouldn't schools? Here's another dono. Thank you for the other dono. Okay.
Be it
I
as
would like
it
to go.
may.
Okay,
Yes?
I'll let Lucy go. Sorry.
Sorry. Be it as it may, if certain people don't have access to the tools, then we can't know if they would have performed to their full potential or not because they don't have the ability to. Like they're just deprived of the ability. We can't know.
100%
And
agree.
we
And wait,
can't
hold on. Lactoid. I want to respond to what you've been saying, okay? Because you're saying, hey, look, I don't really care.
Holy shit! I don't think she was done.
What?
Yes, there's one other thing because
Oh,
based on the answer, one question does come to mind. So are some of the people here saying that education should be barred between a paywall since the essay tuition that is counted as merit is basically based on how wealthy a person or a person's family is, that they can afford the extra lessons to take someone to the extra activities. It is all economy based. So are we saying that education should be barred for certain people based on their economic ability?
I think everything in society will be in some cases barred, right? That's like saying all athleticism should basically be like completely barred because somebody had more money to get better coaches when they were 10 years old. Yeah, it sucks that obviously if you have more money, you're going to be able to write a better essay. And I don't even know if I necessarily agree that like that merit argument is very good. Like, oh, just because you have a better essay, you're somehow more qualified to like succeed in college. But I don't think that like your access to educational tools when you're young should like. It's just I don't think it's basically impossible. I think to like equalize that.
I just want
I feel like we're so far from like where we could.
Wait, it's not.
I would like
Go ahead, Lactoid. Just interrupt all the women on the panel. Just keep going.
I was gonna, but I decided to revert from my sexist ways. Go ahead.
Me and Lucy finally have space. Thank you. Okay. What me and Lucy are arguing, going back to the merit stuff, is that there are certain things that are assumed as merit that it turns out don't map on very well to skill in the workplace. So again, I'm going to lean on the help field specifically, but I can guarantee you somebody's capacity to write a sick research paper, that nobody will read because it's fucking boring. They're going to skip immediately to your discussion system because the way that we've taught people to write papers is fucking insane and boring. And by the way, tons of researchers are arguing that our prose formatting is so stupid and alien that it should basically be done away with so that research can be fun again. But regardless, somebody's essay isn't going to determine whether or not they're able to connect with their clients, to actually be helpful, to be able to properly put their finger on what potentially is the issue with, and help transition that client to better functioning and health, right? An essay might cue that, but it's a really bad measure. This is why, for example, essays are almost completely done away in psychology fields because it's a really bad measure. Same with GREs. So I'm willing to grant that for certain jobs like engineers and stuff, there are going to be things like certain measures of testing that map on more closely to their job. I want engineers to have lots of rote memory about a lot of stuff for their work site, but there's a lot of things that don't map on that are silly. There's tons of multiple choice types questions. There's tons of standardized testing things that don't map on very well to skill because half the shit they can just Google and it doesn't actually tell whether or not they can make like good decisions and like work well in a like team flow management system.
You want to
I think
respond
just
to
that,
that?
I think that even if the essay isn't great, which I don't know how effective the essay is at predicting like college success. Again, I'm just going to say that like whatever metric you do use, people who are richer, people who are more privileged are always going to have more access to those tools. You could, even if it's like extracurricular or working at a job, if you want to go for that, richer people are still going to have better access to that.
Not just that, but I looked into it, and yes, there is a strong correlation between single-parent households and poor educational achievement. And when you have more parental involvement in education, you're much more likely to succeed in your education. And to some extent, you can't choose that. I agree. Like it does seem a little bit unfair in the sense of, wow, this person was born with parents who care about them and actually are involved in their education.
Come on, Mom, please, just
I agree.
Close up by a bootstraps, kiddo. Just ask Mom harder.
I agree. I 100% agree. You have situations in which, yes, like someone is born with parents that care about them, and this is going to put them at a massive advantage for a lot of things in their life. But at the end of the day, sometimes, sometimes things are made, not born, right? Sometimes you have heroes that are made, not born. And when you have people who at the end of the day can write incredibly convincingly, can forge a hammer very well, can design a plane perfectly, right? At the end of the day, if you're an employer and you want the best person to do a job like that, it would make sense to be choosing the person who can just do it as opposed to, well, if only they had a better upbringing, maybe they would be good at it. So we're just going to go ahead and give them the benefit of the doubt anyway. We don't give the losing team. We don't give the losing team 10 points.
It's not refuting what she's saying.
And employers, you're not. This is such a bad analogy. Just to be clear, though, but just to be clear, an education place is not going to be the same as an employer. Employers are only going to determine about how good you are because they're hiring you and paying you for a job. At an education center where their job is to help build and grow you and you're paying them to mentor you, there is way more flexibility and way less of a needed meritocracy.
Yeah.
Their job is to make money off you.
I'm gonna lose my mind. Okay, hey, Lactoid. I feel like you're being hypocritical here because let's say I'm brought in for a crime, okay, and this black lawyer who was educated from Harvard and only got in for affirmative action comes and assists me, and I'm like, oh, perfect, this is my lawyer. And then some fucking white guy who never went to Harvard was like, I applied and I had the potential, but I wasn't able to go because of this affirmative action. I would say, look, I don't care. This black person is able to help me too. I don't care that he was unjustly helped. He is the person who can help me. It seems like you're aware that there is systemic action, but you are only wanting to displace it at a point where you feel like whites are unjusted instead of earlier where black people are. And
No,
it
no,
Well,
no,
he
no.
was
feels
opposed to legacy admissions. I will grant him.
No, no, no. Yeah, so
Sure.
not
There
only am I
seems
opposed to
to
legacy
be-
admissions, but I want to respond to that, okay? Because there
Okay.
are a couple things that were said. The first thing that you said, there is a point of discrimination. I understand your point, and it's an interesting point, but I'm mostly concerned when it comes to government discrimination. Okay, so I don't think that just because you happen to have a culture that like prioritizes single motherhood, that because that exists and because that leads to poor overall outcomes, that therefore the government gets to do their own racism or like their own sort of like negative control in which they discriminate against white people in order to like make up a gap that isn't my fault. To make up a gap that I had nothing to do with, that the government had nothing to do with necessarily, right? When it comes to single motherhood, I will disagree with you on that if you're going to make that point. But then, second of all, when you bring up the example of you have the black lawyer from Harvard compared to the white guy who just simply didn't get in that scenario, it would be a very difficult choice. Okay. But the unfortunate reality is,
hold on.
wait. Let me finish my point real quick. Because the unfortunate reality is, if you have a black lawyer from Harvard and a Asian lawyer from Harvard, you'd be stupid to not go with the Asian because of affirmative action. Affirmative action makes the consumer be racist when they otherwise wouldn't be. I don't want to be racist, but because I know affirmative action gives a black person an advantage, I'm picking the Asian every time.
Okay. Wow.
flip it.
Right, so there seems to
Boom.
be this interesting assumption that poor parents don't care for their children. Am I hearing this correctly? That would be
Statistically
my
more
first-
likely to not care.
Well, sure, but
strong
we say
correlation
statistic,
between-
but there's obviously a correlation, right, between single motherhood, but I can also point to a strong correlation between single motherhood and crime-ridden neighborhoods, and I can also point to a link between crime-ridden neighborhoods and impoverished neighborhoods, and I can also point to a link to impoverished neighborhoods and historically marginalized communities.
But there
Like
seems
I
to
can draw
be-
these lines all over the place, and it seems interesting that you're drawing one line and not the other.
Well, I don't think he's trying to make like a causal thing saying that like, single parent mothers, they just hate their children and they don't want them to learn. There's probably a lot of other conflating variables and stuff like that. But on average, they're probably a lot less involved with their kids' education or have the
course.
resources to involve their kids.
Of
And I think that's
course.
just like,
They
that's just
don't-
true.
I
Like-
100% agree.
There seems
that-
to be.
Go ahead,
Yeah?
Lucy.
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. There seems to be a misunderstanding about what affirmative action is and what it sets out to do. When it comes to education, it's supposed to put people on equal ground to get the education. Ideally, it is followed by support, as I said, psychological and other types of support. And when it comes to hiring, it does not become a case of we see that this person is less qualified, we will hire that person. No, it becomes the case of this person is actually extremely qualified, but there are not many people like this within this field, so I will hire this person because there is an under.
Yes,
there-
the scenario
Yeah.
that gets brought up, just to clear this up, like in a hiring situation or in an admission situation, you have one slot left, you have two equally qualified candidates, right? So both seem to be qualified. One
So it's
scores
different.
higher on diversity than the other, so the diversity gets them in,
Like,
right?
that-
And
it's
that
not
is
like
the
the-
common scenario and argument. that
There is
used,
no
right?
incompetent lawyer who just gets because of the affirmative action and just doesn't know what they're doing actually. I mean, I would like to see examples of that.
Yeah, so real quick, I reject all this, right? Again, people for some reason, I've heard this all the time, like, well, as long as you're competent, like there's two competent people, and then we look at other factors and then we decide. Like, who decides competency? There's no two ethereal boxes of competent and incompetent, right?
Wait, that's
It's a spectrum. It's a spectrum, okay? Competency is a spectrum. Somebody who scores a 4.0 GPA is more competent than a person who scores a 3.5 when it comes to GPA, okay? They are more competent, even though both are quote unquote competent, right? Whatever that your personal line is for determining whether or not somebody's competent, one is better than the other. And then
Oh,
the two,
that's
and then the 3.5 is more than the 3, and the
So
3 is more than the
depends,
2.5.
though. In
No,
what?
no, I
That's
agree. So
actually
I'm
not
talking, I
true.
referred to specifically GPA. You could talk about SATs. The person
No,
who
no,
scores a higher
I'm
SAT.
talking about GPA.
Okay.
Even in GPA,
No,
you've
it's
got,
one.
okay, what if I've got somebody who's taking a bunch of sociology classes versus
Yes.
somebody? Okay, so
Yeah,
obviously,
you're
I'm
right.
sure you would grant me that. What about somebody who is like me? Okay, I can fucking destroy multiple choice questions. I don't know why. I've just got a really good memory for it. I annihilate them. That doesn't actually necessarily mean that I'm more competent than somebody else. It just means I have a fucking incredible rote memory. But there are incredibly competent people who are more competent than me that probably don't have as good of a rote memory. So even GPA, while it is a good predictor of success, is also still falling short of competency. The question of evaluating competency is one of the biggest conversations in like most levels of psychological assessment.
Yeah,
Like,
this is what I'm saying though. This is what I'm saying though, right? What I'm saying is that competency is not non-competent and competent. It's a very difficult and sometimes subjective, but you have to look at every single like individual metric and determine, are they more competent at this specific thing, or are they less competent on this specific thing? Not that they fit into one of the single boxes. So yes, somebody who's a higher SAT score is more competent at the SAT. Someone who is an engineering major who's taking the same courses as another person and they have a 4.0 GPA compared to a 3.5, they are more competent, right? There's like competency hold on real quick. Competency is a spectrum, okay? And so when you look at affirmative action, which is by definition putting less competent people in positions of power. That's the point of it. All right. And this is not just in college. This is also in employment, right? The Department of Labor, literally on their website for their how they dictate terms to federal contractors, mandate affirmative action for federal contractors. Plenty of private employers, yes, and public employers together all mandate affirmative action in which they give unfair prejudicial benefits to minority groups if that minority group is underrepresented in that field. This is factually true. You can look this shit up. It's on the Department of Labor's .𝙎𝙪𝙗𝙬𝙬 website. You can find it.
Yes, it is. It might be required. That might be true, but I think we're looking at a pretty major misunderstanding on what affirmative action is when it comes to hiring. I know it's not the topic of today's thing, but I would like to see it demonstrated that one of the main goals of affirmative action is to hire less competent people, and that it's the point of affirmative action. Could you demonstrate that in any way?
So I don't think the point of affirmative action is necessarily because like we hate white people. I think the point of affirmative action is that a lot of people, especially people to the left, they look at the current landscape in the economy and higher education, and they are uncomfortable with the fact that white people and Asians and Jews, all three of those groups, dominate, and the fact that Black people and Hispanic groups do very, very poorly and don't get in nearly as high rates, that they drop out at much higher rates, that they fail out at higher rates, that they tend to occupy the bottom 20% of the class when they do get in. Like, this makes people very uncomfortable because a lot of people of this school of thought have this belief, well, we're all equal, and it's because of like not having access to these opportunities. But then once people are put into these opportunities, they don't do as well.
No, wait, hold on.
Wait, you think?
Go ahead.
We are just looking at you when you're saying opportunities. Okay, you're doing a lot of you're doing a lot of shortcuts there because you are just looking at educational opportunities and not all of the myriad of opportunities that happen earlier in their life. The reason why people are uncomfortable when they look at these percentages on how much Black people and Hispanic people are failing in colleges is because we know the history of this country. We're not blind to it. We know why these happen, and we can see a pretty causal link between a huge history of this discrimination that ended very recently and in some cases are still existing, and compare that to acceptance to performance. And we're saying, hey, this is probably not some race science thing. Maybe we have disenfranchised these people, and maybe there are ways to fix that. And I agree that it is easy and sloppy to do it through affirmative action. Again, there's so many better, more effective ways that we can actually address these issues. But these are issues.
But
yeah.
Then advocate for those.
Okay,
don't advocate for this fucking one.
Somebody on this panel is advocating.
Well, then join my side and let's shit on this one, and then maybe on the next panel We can talk about your shit, and maybe
Because-
I don't know.
because
Maybe
you're-
I'll agree
you're
with it.
doing-
I don't know.
You're doing the shit that's part of the problem, right? Part of the problem is that there's like a cultural preferentialism for certain like dominantly white cultural things, right? This is why, for example, let's get honest, in workplaces, for example, there are absolutely things like the tone and volume of your voice that in certain cultures being quieter is much more standardized, and in other cultures being louder is much more normalized. And people of color often are from cultures where being loud is fine, which, by the way, both of these things are morally neutral. It's fine to be quiet and it's fine to be loud, but absolutely there can be punitization. There are Black women who've had issues with their hair. There are absolutely a number of preferentialisms for things that are tend to be white centric, right? Not exclusively white centric, but in our culture dominantly that. And because of this, there's going to be a long history of issues that people of color come across. And so when the cases of like opportunities, we're talking about multiplicities of opportunities. We're talking about issues like, why was there redlining? Why is there cases where there is just people of like basically, like I think they're still called ghettos, unironic ghettos with underfunded and oftentimes teachers who don't want to go there, who are qualified because it's probably an awful place to teach at, with high levels of crime, with high levels of poverty, with high levels of single motherhood. And how do we address that? Not a single person on this panel, by the way, has been like, yeah, I fucking love quotas. I love affirmative action. It's based. Nobody has said that. So you're fighting against ghosts, which you said at the very beginning of this panel you are going to do, but you keep yelling at us. So chill.
Well, I'm gonna keep yelling it because I said I'm gonna fight the ghost, so I'm gonna. Okay, first of all, and second of all, the quotas. No one has advocated for quotas. I'm not even fighting against quotas. I'm talking about affirmative action as practiced in the United States. Okay, we can leave quotas. We can leave quotas to the side. I'm never gonna refer to quotas because ostensibly they don't happen in America, even though they do.
How do you want to deal with the educational inequality? How do you want to deal with it?
So. I don't know. I don't necessarily think that it's my prerogative to do it. Okay, to be frank with you, I don't see it as my goal to do so. And when it comes to the hair and the volume, I'm less concerned about that. I don't know how much that has to go into college admission. I personally wouldn't give a fuck.
You are going.
Hold on. Hey. I understand.
Okay,
but when we're talking,
sure you're attributing the correct
for sure. Yeah. Okay, sure. Yes. We're talking about workplaces. Sure, there might be some private employers who, ultimately, I am in favor of private employers choosing who they want to work for them. And if they don't like somebody having hair that they don't want, or they don't like somebody being louder than they don't want, they should be able to choose not to, if they don't want to, hire them. I personally wouldn't give a fuck. But when we're talking about affirmative action in colleges, right? Mm-hmm. The sort of white-centric, what sort of white-centric, parameters are you looking at, right? The SAT. Is
You're
that
a great
white-centric?
example. You think that essays are these basic skills, and as long as you learn the formula, when Purdue OWL itself has wholly rejected prose and basically said that there's no such thing as proper grammar in English because essays are way more. Look it up on Purdue, right?
Well,
You've treated essays like a calculation, which is
the SAT white-centric? Is that a biased white-centric metric?
I'm not sure. I would have to look into SAT history specifically.
Okay, enough. I have a question just real quick. 𝙬𝙬. I'm asking 𝙬𝙬 you specifically, so you'll get to respond. I promise you. There's no such thing as proper grammar in English. Is that something that's been said? Look at
it on Purdue OWL. Yeah, they've wholly rejected proper prose.
But we do agree that there is effective communication versus ineffective communication.
Yes,
communication.
How do we teach grammar then?
How
should we teach grammar?
Ask the writer Blood Meridian. I don't know what to tell you.
I'm asking you, Rora, for the raid.
Hold on. I'm asking you.
Because
you have endorsed the opinion. Wait, hold on. 𝙬𝙬. You have endorsed the opinion that grammar isn't real. Okay, and I'm asking you.
That's not what I've said.
You said there's no correct grammar.
Yes. You said Purdue has rejected the concept that there is proper prose or proper grammar. I've never said don't use grammar.
Okay, so how, in your opinion, should we be teaching kids proper grammar? Because there's no such thing as proper grammar according to Purdue. So how should we teach them?
I think we should.
Does "and" go before "is," or does "is" go before "and"? Is there any rules for this shit?
You want me to now be based on Purdue's statements? You want me to develop a grammatical lecture, but you don't want to answer the question of education inequality? You get to throw your hands up.
I answered it. I said it's
you
not
said
my
I don't know. It's not my prerogative.
I said it's not my prerogative.
Purdue OWL said there's no such thing as prose.
Let me be very clear.
I don't need to find how to develop proper grammar.
Wait. Let me be very clear. Let me be very clear. When I say it's not my prerogative, it's not my problem. I didn't cause any of that fucking shit, so it's not my fucking problem to solve
Okay.
any of this shit.
Sorry,
And
do
I'm
we
not
live
gonna
in a
fucking. I'm not
community?
gonna
Do we
sit.
live in a society? Do we live
We
in a
live in a
democracy?
society. Oh, whatever.
No,
Who
yeah,
gives a fuck,
sorry.
okay.
You're right.
So
I
it's not
personally
my fucking
contributed to
problem.
Purdue deciding that there's no problem. So there is
So why would you cite
improper
them?
grammar.
Why would you cite them if you don't care about them?
Because she's saying.
Think about it. Actually, hold on, Lactoid. Why did I talk
holding.
about this? Why did I bring any of this up? Tell me what my argument is.
You brought it up because I argue that essays are like, depending on the prose of an essay, could somewhat accurately indicate how intelligent or how capable somebody is. And this just was very problematic for you because you said, well, actually, this is a terrible statement. Purdue University says there's no such thing as correct grammar. You brought that up. So my question for you is,
What is
why
my
would you bring
argument?
it?
Why
would you?
bringing it up?
You
I'm
are
asking
obviously
you to
you're obviously bringing up Purdue's the citation to Purdue by saying there's no such thing as correct grammar to refute my position, which is that I think essays are a good thing when it comes to determining whether or not somebody's capable.
So
Okay. I will.
Yep.
If I could answer Lucy,
Yeah,
just
let's let 𝙎𝙪𝙗𝙬 and Lactoid go back and forth a little
Yeah.
bit. This is interesting. to
and
me.
Lucy can stand me. Okay.
Yeah,
I
I
really want to
promise.
get in. I want
Okay.
to defend there's no such thing as proper grammar. That's what I want to do.
So the idea of proper grammar has been dismissed by Purdue, and I brought it up because Purdue is the closest thing English has to a property authority. Because as I'm sure you all know, there is no authority of English, which, by the way, in like Spanish, there are authorities for the language. So English is very weird because we don't have an authority. Purdue is like the closest thing, but I'm sure you might find another body that you like more, which is fine. There is improper grammar. For example, if you've made a sentence in English and it makes no sense, that would be really bad grammar. But there are no absolute rules in grammar. This is why one of the great endeavors of a ton of different creative writers, for example, is constantly breaking different things of grammar to make certain points. People actually include grammar into how they read Blood Meridian. That's like the purpose, half the point of that fucking book is just to bastardize grammar.
Let me respond then, because what
$2
you just said.
$2 from Insomnia Nor to say stop inviting racists on Lactoid. Okay, thanks.
Blah blah.
Fair
Yeah.
enough.
One specific thing that you said right there was, yes, there is such thing as improper grammar when you form a sentence that doesn't make any sense. Would you agree with me then that if you apply to college and you write an essay in which more of your sentences make sense as opposed to less of your sentences make sense, that this means that you are a better essay writer, and therefore that essays. Hold on. And for that reason, essays do matter and can matter when it comes to applying for college.
What do you think my answer is going to be to that question?
It's going to be yes. I'm sorry, Lactoid, you were right. That's what I think
no,
the answer is.
The answer is going to be yes, because you're clearly still not fully understanding what I'm actually arguing here.
Okay.
Right? The fact that you would even ask me that question suggests that you're still not grasping it. So the reason that they reject absolute rules for grammar is that even if we set rules in English, they can be broken because there is no absolute authority. It is proper to break grammar rules in a whole bunch of ways constantly. Commas can be used for effect. Periods can be used for effect. The prose that is able to effectively communicate an idea is what matters. So I would have an issue, for example, with an SAT that got dinged because commas were in the wrong place, or they didn't like how long the run-on sentences were, even if the ideas were compelling, powerful, and better than anybody else. It's the same thing, for example, with APA citation. People will lose 5% grades because they didn't italicize the journal label, even though the research article that they did is fucking brilliant. And that's the shit that's fucking cringe.
Wait,
Right.
do college admissions actually do that? Do they actually dock you based on your grammar?
When I wrote research papers,
does.
I would
And-
lose
and
5%
style
for
as well.
every
100%.
APA.
Yeah,
I've never
does.
heard about that for college
Stylizations.
admissions.
Wait.
That's crazy.
So hold on. It does, but then my question for you then, which maybe we can come to some agreement as to, I think that the actual point is more important than, as long as it's understood and it's compelling as opposed to where the comma is. I agree with that. But then my question for you then is, do you have any evidence or any reason to believe that this impacts affirmative action whatsoever? That there's certain racial demographics that the reason that they're scored lower in essays is not because they're making less compelling points, but because their commas are in the wrong place.
The answer is yes.
Okay, where is this research?
Well,
If I may.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Lucy,
go ahead,
back up
Lucy.
your statement. You said yes, that there is compelling
as
evidence. Can you provide that evidence?
Well, I can speak to this a little bit as I am actually certified to teach English, interestingly enough. And in languages, because I think it goes a bit beyond the ultimate authority argument. We can speak to this when we talk about all languages. There is the standard version of a language that we usually broadly teach, but throughout all languages, there are smaller groups within a society or regional differences within societies that can get discriminated against because they stray from that standard. And the argument is that those deviations from the norm or standard should not
2 questions
be
for you.
part of a discrimination, and that it reflects in the scores because the way, for example, that Black people speak or communicate is often treated as broken English or bad English, even though it's a legitimate form of
I
English.
understand.
It's a
This-
legitimate
It's a dialect.
not accent,
Uh,
dialect.
yeah, it's a dialect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just
Dialect.
two questions on this for you, Lucy, real quick. So this
Okay.
isn't just an American thing. Beijing does this. Like Beijing accents and things are taught in Chinese education system in China and things like
Yeah.
that. There's a lot of different Chinese
Well,
dialects
it's a
aside
bit
from Mandarin,
different.
but
It's
they
a bit
do
difficult.
right. They
It's
do say like Mandarin is the standard language, right? Like so
Yes.
that is something that they
Well,
go
that's-
for. So my question, before you respond, like I haven't even asked my question yet. Okay,
Yeah,
my
yeah.
question is this, right? If you are unfamiliar with a dialect, does using that dialect tend to make it harder to understand you?
I think it's a bit different when comparing English to Chinese.
Let's stick within
Since-
English in general.
Okay.
Do you think that having a very specific dialect in English that is not common, like let's
Right.
not even use a racial dialect, let's use a Southern dialect, Southern twang, or like 𝕵𝖎𝖎𝖏 on King of the Hill things. It makes you harder to understand, correct?
It will depend.
No, I'm gonna say no.
No,
say
you
no,
get
it absolutely does not make
𝕵𝖎𝖎𝖏,
you-
let me tell you one. You don't understand me now?
Oh,
man?
sorry.
Good-
If I
good.
were speaking your dialect, if I were a Southern gentleman, a
Yeah,
Southern
this
man
is
who
such like
spoke
intense
just
white preferentialism. It's like
yeah, exactly. I've learned how to speak in a specific way, and I am going to be primed to understand people who speak in my similar way. If
Mhm.
I speak to someone who speaks exclusively AAVE, that dialect, the African American, or like some southern dialect, they're going to have more issues understanding me than their neighbor, and that is the point.
Yeah,
No,
generally-
no.
So
No, no, no,
again,
I-
the second question.
Generally,
I'll let Kilo go
Can
next
we?
because Kilo
No, no,
hasn't
no,
gone
you-
yet. The
go ahead.
second question, right?
Yeah.
Is it not within a society or culture's interest, right, to preferential people who are able to be understood by the overall culture as a whole, by the majority of the culture? Is it not within the interest of a culture or a society or a
not
country
at a
or
university.
nation?
Point
At
of
a
language.
university.
Right.
No, at a university.
then-
If your whole conception is about the wrestling of the greatest ideas, if the idea is to pursue intellectualism, then the idea that because like you're not super big fan of the dialect that somebody's using just wholly blocks you from being able to engage with somebody's idea. I don't know what to tell you. Go listen to 𝕑𝖏𝙎 𝙎𝖑. Would you just say 𝕑𝖏𝙎 𝙎𝙑 is an idiot because it's incredibly difficult to understand and it's like kind of like irritates me from like the amount of like water noise in his mouth? Yeah, it's gross and weird and he's hard to understand and his ideas are brilliant anyways. And
We-
the
we are-
idea
No, they're not.
If a
If you
brilliant
talk
idea
like
cannot
Zizek
be
and Zizek,
effectively
you're not gonna
communicated
get
to the
the
masses,
culture,
does
I'll
it
tell
make
you
a
that
sound
much.
like
this is a great level of bias where I can look at 𝕑𝖏𝙎 𝙎𝙑 and disagree with a large portion of what he says and still recognize that he's brilliant and very, very important to listen to, right?
Look,
Just because
yeah.
he's my opposition.
I want to give
wait,
space
you-
to,
you-
just real quick, I want to give space to Kilo because Kilo hasn't had a lot of space on this panel. I wanted him to have some
Oh yeah, Kilo, hello.
I know.
Hey, I'm here. No, it's I mean, Lactoid, do you think that someone could be not particularly intelligent, not be a good performer in school, but like be capable artistically of crafting like this really eloquent, beautiful, like captivating essay that the admissions office would find like really compelling?
Yeah, there's exceptions on both ends. You can have somebody who's like not as intelligent who's able to like craft something particularly like good, and you could have somebody who's intelligent who crafts something shit. But more often than not, it's like a very strong correlation.
Obviously, the Venn
between people.
diagram.
Yeah. There's a very strong correlation, and when you're a university who has like a limited number of spots, it's perfectly rational to be like, oh, you conveyed your ideas understandably and in a succinct manner. I'm more likely going to choose you than somebody who
Okay.
can't.
I was going to bring it back to the meritocracy thing. I don't know if anyone else wanted to finish up with the essay conversation.
Well,
I just go ahead.
Yes. I think I also want to go back to the meritocracy thing because we sort of circle back to the fact that certain people come from certain environments that do not give certain opportunities. And this is where affirmative actions, for example, enters the picture. And even if a person writes an essay within a very obscure dialect, the more standardized way of communicating is a thing that is taught at a college/university
your
level.
job-
So these things
If your job,
are, yeah.
if your task or your goal is to communicate a beautiful idea effectively, right? And you do so in a weird dialect or a dialect
weird-
that is yes, weird. Abnormal.
Weird to who?
Abnormal to the standard.
you.
Whatever the standard happens to be in the culture
No,
or
not
country you
standard.
are
It's to
in.
you.
If you
Because I can
communicate
be in a
it poorly,
community-
you have failed at your task
There's a
fundamentally.
difference between
Because
communicating
no matter
poorly and-
stop. If you have the most beautiful idea ever, but you cannot communicate it, it does not matter
Correct.
how
Correct. But
beautiful
communicate
your
to who?
idea or how great your idea is.
Or-
that does
sorry,
not matter
to use
because you
proper
have been
grammar, to whom?
ineffective at communicating the idea.
So could I respond?
But this
Wick's
is-
so
it's
right.
This is used against ESL people. For example, I bet
True.
you my chat, because Lucy is, I'm guessing you speak multiple languages. I'm guessing at least
Yes.
2, maybe 3.
Yes.
Yeah. Is English your second, or did you learn it at the same time as I think you said you're Polish, right?
Similar time.
Okay, but
early
you have an
childhood,
accent,
yeah.
right? There's a good chance that if I look back in all of our chats, there's a number of people who assume that Lucy was dumb exclusively, probably because Lucy has an accent. Exclusively. This is something I run across, for example, with all of my friends who immigrate from all sorts of locations. Got a good friend named Melina from Sweden. People tell her she's stupid all the time, not because she's actually dumb, but because sometimes she lacks the right words and stuff like this and doesn't know all of the perfect grammar because English is her second language. So we have to be really fucking careful when we're talking about things like it's obvious how to communicate these things, because you can fall and lose really good ideas because it doesn't sound persnickety quite like you would like
And,
first.
and no one is arguing,
me.
right, that people who can't
If I
communicate
could-
effectively are stupid. What we're arguing, and what the argument is that if you have to have, right, if you have a task, but you cannot communicate that task in the language, like if I was speaking to Chinese people, right, from China, I would use Chinese, right, because it would be weird to use English. It would be odd. I would not be able to effectively communicate to them in English. Why would I ever use English to communicate them? That would be silly, right? I would be failing at my task. However, since you're all English, or at least speak English, right? And I don't know Polish, I'm sorry, right? But I use English to
Shame.
communicate my ideas, to communicate what I'm trying to get across.
But-
And if I used Russian or Ukrainian or any other language to do it, I would be failing. No matter how smart I am, no matter how intelligent I am, my task
If I
of communicating
could-
an idea to you would have just failed.
If
No,
I
but
could
the
Lactoid
body
did.
matters.
He did sort of. It's not really
I
concession,
could-
but Lactoid did
if I
say,
could be-
but generally speaking, it's a pretty strong indicator of like capability at writing.
Yeah, not only that, but like we give credit to people who speak 2 languages are going to have in America like an economic advantage, right? If you can speak Spanish and English because you can
Yeah.
reach a wider degree of people,
So if
this
I
is a skill
could-
to this is a skill to have. Now, I'm a Swedish citizen as well, okay, but I don't know Swedish because it wasn't actually like efficient to teach me that in America because nobody here fucking speaks Swedish. What's the benefit of being able to speak a language that people can't understand? It's actually more efficient for me to put my resources into learning how to speak the language that everyone can understand better.
Sure,
If I
but we're
could-
saying. Oh, sorry, Lucy. I keep cutting you off. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So what I'm saying is that within like linguistics broadly, it's at the end of the day, dialect is still the same language, so you are still communicating perfectly well. The thing is that it's just not packed in the way that is accepted as the norm, and the packaging can be learned at the university or college level, which often happens that people write essays in a certain style, and as they go through education, they develop a more standardized or fitting style to the education that they are receiving.
So I like
Yep.
completely disagree. I think that like
100%.
the idea that language is independent of your ability to communicate is like that's the whole point why we have language, is so that we can.
Nobody's
communicate
saying
with
that.
other
No,
people
wait, hold on.
effectively.
That's not what
Nobody's
we're
saying
saying.
that.
Let-
Okay,
okay,
I'm gonna do the
It's
same again.
being
Hold on.
implicit
Hold
If
on.
you want to cut me
Hold
off so
on.
I can finish
Hold
my
on.
point real quick,
Well,
but that's very much exactly
it's-
what Lucy said, talking
That
about
is
how
not what
you can
Lucy
still
It's
have
being
this
implicitly
great
said,
Okay.
language. Yeah, that's okay.
Let's do
Second
another
of all-
game. Doubleshine, can
Sure, go
you
ahead.
tell us what Lucy is arguing, and Lucy will clarify for you if that's what she's actually saying.
Can I just ask Lucy to say it again, maybe, instead of playing games?
I'm actually more interested into seeing if
didn't
you know
understand.
what she's saying.
Yeah,
well,
'cause
then why
I
the
don't really know, because
why
they're
the
not
fuck
very
would you
good at
come in
communicating
and
it.
refute everything that Lucy just said
Because
if
that's
you don't
my
even know her
interpretation
position?
of what they said. Now, if they disagree with me, they're welcome to say it. But I'm not going to play 20 questions to figure out their position. But I think it's actually demonstrating my
But doesn't
point
this
here.
prove? Yeah, doesn't this prove
Yeah.
the point a little bit?
It actually
so-
proves our
No, I feel like this rather enforces the point that we are primed to hear in a very specific way, and Lucy is like spoke this as a second language, and like we're essentially primed in this specific way. Now, what I'm saying is, yes, you have a point that if you go to China, you're going to want to speak in Chinese, but like bilingual people are preferenced in workplaces as they should.
Yes.
But for some reason, we don't apply the same preference to people who can code switch between certain dialects of English to understand that they can communicate in multiple communities. Because I am not
Well,
really that great at
there's-
code switching between like my.
There's no
my-
way of quantifying that information. I can't go into a job interview and say, "Hey, I'm really
Sure,
good at like
Sure,
poor
I can
people
agree
black
that that's a
dialect."
systemic.
Like,
I agree that's a systemic issue, but I'm saying that is a problem where you grew up in a certain dialect and there is only one standardized way of speaking, even though one is not more effective than the other. One is treated as that they are better,
But
and
hold
so
on.
when you have to
Hold on,
learn
they
a
are
new
in
dialect.
different
Wait, hold on, Rick,
contexts.
I'm not done.
Hey, I
Can
understand, but you're starting from a faulty foundation. I want to fix that foundation before you build
Okay,
your
go
house of
ahead.
cards, so it doesn't
Okay, I
all fall
apologize.
down. So let me help
Okay.
you, okay?
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you, Rick.
in different like this idea that the different dialects are better. Yes, in different situations. If I am with people who understand and speak a different dialect, if I can and have that ability to operate and speak in that dialect, it is just objectively better to do so because it aids in communication, it aids in clarity, and we don't have to guess. We can effectively communicate, right?
Yes.
If I insist, even if I have the ability to speak 20 different dialects, but I insist on using an unfamiliar dialect with people who speak the same language, I am failing. I am doing something that
I don't disagree.
But
you
there is
seem to. You
Can I ask
seem to
everyone a
be.
question?
You
I want
may.
to ask everyone a question. When is the last time all of you guys read a research paper from top to bottom and then walked away going, fucking riveting?
Oh,
When's the last time? Really?
top to
Today, I read so much shit on this today.
Top
bottom?
to
Like,
bottom? Top to bottom?
Yes,
You read
top to bottom.
everything?
Yes,
And you
I
walked
read
away
everything
going,
because I go through the
riveting.
data and honestly, because I'll read the fucking abstract and the abstract will say we think that it's beneficial. And, we
I don't
find it
need all
beneficial.
this.
And then
I
you
don't
go
need
back to the fucking data and you're like, wow, that's completely opposite
This
to what
explains
you're
why
saying.
you have this worldview. Okay, I'm going to tell you.
know, true.
Normal
So-
people.
Because I read. Yeah.
No. Normal people. No, I read research articles all the time. I'm going to tell you right now. I read research articles. I think the data and information in them is interesting. And research articles are boring as fuck. They're written so painfully awful. Yes, it's horrible. Multiple researchers are talking about this right now. This is like the huge drama around like the peer review process and the education system that like fixates on basically like this pedantic level of boring. I remember like, for example, when I was writing my thesis, my methodology section, I just wanted to stab my eyeballs out because you're just constantly writing like the same formatting sentences over and over and over again to follow this. Nobody's reading this shit, by the way, unless they have to, which is awful, by the way. And this is because, so here's an interesting fact. I used to be a national level competing poetry writer. I went to university. I got really good at research papers, dominated in research, and I can't write poetry for the life of me now. I can't do it at all.
Up. That's so sad.
Yes.
So-
So there's this
Damn.
preferentialism about the way that we communicate because we say, oh, that's how competent people communicate. But the problem is nobody reads it. The public's not interested in it. Nobody enjoys it. And it breaks our fucking brains from creativity, which I
For
would
the
argue
record-
is probably not a good thing. But then we treat this standardization as just this like holy pilgrim of what is good for writing, which is
Yeah,
cringe, by the
Wait,
way.
It's
let me-
boring
let me-
and
let me
uninteresting
elaborate.
because I
Also-
lack the language to actually properly understand it. Like if I had gone
No.
through, a PhD field and actually, the reason why most research papers are boring is because I have to Google every other word because I don't understand half the shit they're saying. right? Like, for example, if I do like an economics paper, way easier time understanding that because I'm used to the prose, I'm used to the thing. This is just I don't understand because it's only
And you
tells me
read
that
it just like going
understanding
through Wheel
language
of Time,
actually lets
just
you
as
communicate
riveting.
better.
But
Wait,
also,
no, but
So,
that might be
way
true,
more,
but
way
some
more so
people-
than
Wait,
reading
are we
something on
arguing?
like
Are we
medicine,
arguing
which I
there
don't
should be a
understand
narrative
anything.
structure? Stop.
I
Are we
would love to
arguing?
go.
Are we arguing that there should be a narrative structure with like the hero's journey in a research paper?
Do you think that that's what anyone is arguing?
That is what when you say why are like when the assertion is that these are
Okay,
boring and
I'm
no
gonna
one is
ask everyone
interested
to
in.
do
What makes
second
things
level
what
analysis
makes
of
what
anyone's
makes
statements.
things
You want, like,
interesting?
colorful pictures
What
in
makes
there,
things
too, or-
interesting, right?
Yeah,
Is
colorful
the
pictures
narrative
are great,
structure.
actually.
People are drawn to the narrative structure and storytelling, right? In the
Well,
format of storytelling, the hero's journey, the
So-
archetypes, and
Wait,
things like
hold
that.
on, hold on.
So
Isn't this
not
panel
out
gonna
without
work?
this,
What the
that's
fuck are
not-
you talking
it's
about?
not
I'll
gonna
just
work.
bite this bullet. Yes, some of the greatest research articles I have ever read absolutely establish a narrative. The narrative is different than like Fido and his like friend boy went on a journey to go find to discover which statistical methodology is best for evaluating like predictive rock curves.
So-
But what is interesting, for example, is like theoretical speculative pieces that go through the history and understanding of like why we come to understand eudaimonia as it is, and then after it's established it outlines to you why it's important to understand eudaimonia, how we analyzed it within this study, and then what implications not just it has in the data, but what it could possibly have in both a factual and narrative interesting way. The idea that because it's a narrative, it's now just like fiction and we should have fairies in the corner is obviously
So-
not true, and such a fucking insane way to even characterize this. Obviously, nobody on this panel is asking for colored storybooks of research. But yeah, a little
I
bit
am.
better writing would be great, except for
I
A
would
Keelan.
love
little bit more
So-
narrative.
Wait,
I
wait,
the pictures.
hold on. So I 100% agree with what Erudite was saying, but I want to follow on to the point that this very rote and rigid way of speaking in narration, that we can call that a dialect. I'm fine with that. Some people in certain communities are primed to speak that more than others. Spoiler alert, it's the white ones. And that is a form of white centrism. That is a form of preferential treatment where some communities are speaking in ways that are completely foreign to the others, and they have to essentially learn a new language while they are learning science and math and all of that other things while they move into grade school. And that is
Why?
that is a barrier.
That
is a
seems
barrier.
why. Why are they not learning? Right? Why are they not learning?
No, they have to
this
learn.
more standard, right?
No, they
Why do
have
you
to.
think
No,
it is?
they are learning. I'm saying Black kids have to learn a new dialect while learning everything else. While when I grew up in school, I didn't have to learn shit. I didn't have to learn any new way of speaking. And because I grew up in a house where that was just normalized. And that's essentially what I'm saying. That is a barrier to success when some people are having to learn way more
We'll teach
than the
chemistry and ebonics next time. I think
Yeah.
that will definitely fix it.
Unfortunately,
That's
it
actually
is
no.
it is a
unironically.
natural barrier
No,
rather
we're
than an imposed barrier. This isn't-
Unironically, what's
stop-
wrong with that? What is
Stackium,
wrong with
Stackium.
what is
Teach it
wrong
in
with
every
that?
fucking dialect in every language,
Because-
like this fucking.
It
No,
would
having teachers that are able to speak both and able to maybe code switch a little bit with their students might be more beneficial towards those students who are learning.
what we want. The most beneficial thing to a student is to teach them the dialect of the majority. It just is.
Oh, please!
It
But
just
that's
is.
prefer-
It just is. The more people you can effectively communication, like this is a big thing for me. Being
think
able to effectively communicate is one of the biggest drivers of how
But that's
successful you
not
will be in
effective
life.
So if
communication
I
when you're
could-
isolating.
When
10%
my
of
mom
the
Oh,
learned
it is!
English,
Oh.
if you can get
it was to
100%
fit
that's
in.
better than 90. I'm not saying don't
If
speak.
you-
I'm not saying
okay.
just reject
But
this
when
dialect.
you-
I'm saying
The
we should be
reason that they
forced-
learn this is because they need to, right? If we required Americans, kids,
Uh-huh.
right, to learn more languages, that would be a good thing. That would be a
Right.
good thing, okay? That's not a bad thing to require.
Okay,
I disagree. We should all
We need-
only
hold
speak
on.
to
We
English.
need to
cut
zoom
out
out.
every other language.
hold on. We need to zoom out. Just to be clear, I'm not advocating that like formal essays be sent in ebonics at all. I don't give a fuck about any of this shit. I'm actually opposed to essays being like the entrance modality at all, especially with ChatGPT. Who gives a fuck about an essay at this point? I also think SATs are cringe. What we're actually talking about here is education inequality and how to address it. And we're talking about systemic issues that are going to impact people differently and trying to figure out what the differences specifically are. If there is a culture that has some level of like preferentialism to a certain style that is morally neutral, it's not necessarily better that you're super rigid and boring. And when you talk about chemistry, I bet you every single person has a famous, like their favorite professor, for example, of geology or chemistry or anything, are probably teachers who include stories and narratives and explain things in really interesting ways, not just dry technical ways. And all I'm advocating for is that a greater flexibility is understood when we're like administering people. I'm not even for affirmative action, just to be clear, just so we're not like zooming into like this like super annoying hyper pedantic position that nobody's asking for. What we're talking about is how does our society view different cultural norms that people are raised in, and how does that impact their capacity to engage in different professional spaces? And is there some level of systemic bias that does occur for certain populations that have different cultural values that might be somewhat less prioritized in certain settings? That's all we're talking about. And then how do we address that? Because just by the way, because Lactoid's argument was that it is not culturally valued specifically in certain educations in people who are underperforming. So we were biting that bullet, agreeing that it might be a cultural thing, and then talking about how that culture might be affecting it. And now Mr. Culture Argument is laughing at the idea of culture arguments. So
no, wait. I'm not denying, real quick, I'm not denying that like people might have like, especially like people who maybe come to this country and don't speak English, like there's going to be cultural reasons why they're going to be struggling for sure in certain ways. But no, I don't think that this is like a reason to have the academic system bend to people who have an incompatible culture as opposed to the other way around, right? I think it's perfectly, it should be expected that people who have a culture that does not compart with the majority to have to change, right? Because there's a lot of cultural practices, specifically among the Black community, that are not compatible with success, right?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Disproportionately. And we're not going to be like, well, single motherhood, that's just like a cultural thing. Yeah, well, it might be, but also there's a lot of fucking problems.
Nobody has said that single motherhood is a cultural thing. What we're talking about
it is a cultural thing, though.
Dialectical preferences, but I don't know if I would agree that it's a cultural thing. It's certainly a systemic thing.
Wait, but no one's arguing that it's a positive.
Do you think it's a cultural value for Black people to be single mothers?
In America, like 67% of Black kids grow up in single motherhoods.
And you think that's values?
You think that's a correlation?
Value?
You think there's a correlation between that and then wait, Lactoid.
Wait, why? Lactoid, now you're being stupid.
No.
Lactoid, stop. Lactoid. Why do you think that single motherhood is a cultural value of Black people? I'm really interested to hear you explain this.
Yeah, so when we talk about Hispanic people, we talk about their cultural values. And one of the things that they culturally value very strongly is the family. There's also, like in Asians, for example, they very culturally value the family and value and the family's perception. And we're perfectly willing to accept this, right, when it comes to how they look at the family. But then when it comes to the vast majority of Black people in America who simply don't have this cultural appreciation for the family and don't have the cultural appreciation for a two-parent household, all of a sudden that's no longer cultural? That's no longer a cultural appreciation?
Do you think it's because they don't culturally value it? Or do you think that they're arrested, Black men specifically, are arrested at astronomically higher rates?
You think that leads to three-quarters?
Maybe reason that this happens.
No. You think that's the reason why two-thirds of Black kids grow up without a father? You think that's the reason? You can look at the numbers. The numbers just simply don't fucking add up that way.
Not all of them, obviously.
Not even close.
If I could steelman you.
If you look
okay, go Kilo. I'd love to steelman Lactoid out of this. I think I understand what he's trying to say. Are you what? Because I don't think you're trying to say Black people value single motherhood. I feel like what you're maybe saying is that they have certain cultural values that might perpetuate circumstances of single motherhood. Is that what you're saying?
So when you don't value something, like that's simply a negative value. It's like the same thing, like you're not valuing a two-parent household in the same way that a Hispanic or an Asian family does.
I didn't take it as him asserting that they preferred single motherhood households.
But,
like that's
okay.
I didn't take that way.
But
my question is
now, I guess.
My question is, Lactoid, are there no other contributing factors? Even if I were to say like maybe it's a little bit of a cultural thing, is that cultural like proclivity influenced
Primarily
by
a
other
cultural
contributing
thing.
factors? No. So
Right.
let's say that it is. Is that cultural proclivity influenced by other factors? Or do you think
It could
all
be.
things are equal and they just like this is just how they
Yeah,
turn
but see,
out
this is
generally?
this
Wait,
is
wait, hold on. It very well
It
could be.
should be.
It very well could be that like there's circumstances that led to this happening, and it could be that even now, like there probably is some, very small, but there's some percentage of like Black absentee fathers that because of the war on drugs, they're in prison, right? That very
Okay.
well could be the case, right? But like overall, like that, and especially any kind of actions from the government
Wait.
or me had very, very little.
No,
to do
you
with
can
that.
stop right. Well, very little to do with it. So I think
Yeah.
it's kind of disingenuous
government?
if you acknowledge that there are other contributing factors to those cultural tendencies. When you say in the comparison between like Asian American households and Black households, all you're saying is, well, the only cultural distinction between those two things is like nuclear family focuses in the Asian American families and single
One of the
motherhood.
distinctions.
But the other ones, the things that lead to those things being present, I think are much more important than just saying like yes, you're identifying a cultural distinction between the two like demographics. I'm
But we
saying
can-
what causes that in the first
can
place.
point
Okay,
to
wait,
very real
stop handing the ball. Hold on, stop handing the ball. Just tell me, how did the government make the single motherhood Black problem? How did they
Okay,
do
so
that?
let me ask you, do you think that poor communities would probably have a higher tendency of winding up having single motherhood households at a high rate?
On average, but the rates simply, hold on real quick, the rates are like nowhere near comparable, which is even when you control for social economic status, like Black two-parent households are much more common than, white two-parent households are much more common than Black two-parent households.
When we talk about impoverished areas, when we talk about a lack of capital investment and career opportunities, when we talk about the public education disparity that was, we're talking about a lot of different things that might be leading to this being present, not just so just saying it's a cultural thing just feels like it's disingenuous. It doesn't really like do it justice. And also,
To be clear,
I'm not trying to attack you. It just, I think when you say that, you have to. Well, no, I'm not trying to attack you personally for your position. I think you just have to make it clear that you're not saying I think Black people just wind up being single mothers more commonly. Like, there's obviously other factors at play.
Well, look, I don't disagree with you that there's like there could have very well been like historical circumstances which led to Black culture
Like
being
the
the way
crack
it is.
epidemic
Okay?
versus
I
the
don't
heroin
deny, right? I don't deny this is the case. But like
Well, you are denying
the
it. And you say
the
it
fact
could
is.
be.
Well,
You're
I'm saying it could be.
very well. Why don't you just say yeah?
I'm saying it could be because unless you guys demonstrate to me like objectively, I could be wrong. So I'm saying it very well could be. It's a rational intuition statement to say that this very well could have had something to do with it. Okay. Now that being said, when we're looking at it right now, like we know that the culture is like the primary issue here, and no, I don't think that like higher education should have to kowtow to a culture that like is not compatible with higher education. It doesn't make any sense.
So, can I?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So I think you were starting to delve into arguments that we cannot really demonstrate. I don't think just because something happens, we can clearly demonstrate because a thing happens in group X, therefore it has to be caused by culture or some cultural biases of the group. So I'm not sure if it's even worth continuing this line of logic. And going back to the dialect thing, we go back to the environments that foster certain opportunities and foster certain abilities to communicate more effectively in a certain way. And I think that affirmative action, what it's designed to do, is to look at the student that applies with an essay written with a dialect to see how well the essay is written in the dialect and to see if it's a promising person that will do well when taught the more standardized way of communicating during the course of the education. And the last thing would be for me to say that actually course books, class books, workbooks used to be more narrativized in their writing. I have a biology book from early 20th century. I think it was my great-grandmother's, and it was, in fact, yes, written in a lot more narrative-based way than it is. It was written in a more flowery language than textbooks tend to be written now. So even that sort of has historically changed as education moved forward.
I've appreciated the discussion. However, I just looked at the time and I realized we're a bit over time. We're not going to end the discussion, but we are going to give people a chance if they need to go do other things. Now's your chance. So I want to give everyone a chance to have very, very quick, please, closing statements, and then we'll just keep it on. So if you want in on this, if you've been listening to this and raging, jump in the backstage and we'll pull you on after these are done. Doubleshine, let's start with you, and we'll just go around quickly, please.
Are we doing endings or
Yeah,
just like
closings?
shoutouts, or-
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah. In
stay
general,
low
I
if you
think
want. So.
yeah, affirmative action. It kind of sucks. Nobody supports it. I think it just causes more racial problems and more racial tensions. And pretty much all the problems that affirmative action tries to fix they can be like targeted in so much more effective ways that actually hit the root issue of people's like opportunity of education, especially at the K to 12 level, being like really stinted. Anyways, I'm Doubleshine. You can find me on Twitch and Twitter at Doubleshine TV. I've been kind of switching from like politics to gaming stuff, so you're not going to find a lot of my debate stuff. But hey, I always appreciate getting invited on to scream at people. It's a ton of fun.
Well, I'm glad you came, and hopefully you stay for the after panel, because I think it's going to get a little spicy. We have some people been DMing me. We'll see, right? Kilo, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, Kilo, thanks for inviting me, Wick. I filled in last minute, so I was a little bit unprepared. We covered like a lot of bases. I think one thing that I found through the course of the conversation is in kind of delving into and dissecting the issue of affirmative action, we figured out that there was one ingredient of it, like the essay and the language thing, that's extremely complicated. So if we were to pivot away from something like affirmative action and equal opportunity and introduce like a more merit-based, performance-based system, there's a lot of complexities and difficulties and obstacles that come along with that too. Basically, all I've wound up with is that affirmative action, I think, is kind of racist. I'm still against it, but I think we did a good job of demonstrating that other solutions are not so simple. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Kilo, thank you again for coming in last minute. Really appreciate you.
Yeah.
Lactoid, please.
Yeah, I want to first of all thank you, Wick, for having me on. Thank you for taking up my proposal, and to all of the good people here who discussed this with me, and especially the people who disagreed with me and fought with me and challenged my ideas. Thank you so much. I thrive on that, so absolutely love it. If you liked what I had to say, you can find me at Lactoid TV on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube. Because I'm going to keep this short, I'm not going to go into the anecdote about how I know and how I figured out that at least my law school was pushing for quotas, but under the rug kind of bullshit. So a lot of schools probably do this without actually telling people. The way I find out was somewhat of an accident. But yeah, so I think most of all, of course, this is irrelevant to the broader debate, but most of all, it was a good discussion, and let's hope the Supreme Court overturns it. So,
thank you. Go check them out, gang. Staxiums.
Yeah, so I 100% agree that affirmative action is flawed. But I do think that it's largely positive. I think there are a lot more things that we can fight for racial injustice. And where would you find those things to fight for? Well, you can go to my TikTok, Twitter, YouTube. I'm Staxiums everywhere.
Check them out, gang. Really appreciate you coming. NotSoErudite, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm NotSoErudite. You can find me at probably all the self-evident locations. In regards to affirmative action, the only reason I would be in favor for affirmative action is if it addressed the major education inequalities that I perceive in North America. The problem is that I'm not convinced that it is actually effective. And so while I think I actually believe the bill is well intended, I just think it is ineffective. And so what I'm interested in is more programs like Head Start being advocated for to actually tackle issues of educational inequality and white preferentialism within both our academic institutions and society.
Thank you once again for being here and arguing very effectively for your points. Lucy, please.
Right. So as I see it, it basically will be similar to what I said at the beginning, that the US is in a situation where there are groups that have been disfranchised for, we could actually say, hundreds of years if we include slavery into the whole calculation. And there are systemic problems which need systemic solutions, and affirmative action is a band-aid sort of solution that it attempts to somewhat even the scales. But what I am afraid is that if affirmative action is simply removed, it will simply kill the conversation about addressing the problem with it. So that's basically my
Where can people find you?
at my YouTube, which is 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙𝖘𝖍𝖔𝖜,
Okay,
basically.
Can I add one last little thought?
you can. And
If
we
you're
are going
gonna
to
get
open
rid,
it up.
I
so,
hope
yeah.
I hope when affirmative action gets overturned, so does legacy admissions, just so we're really consistent about not caring about
Definitely.
immutable characteristics.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Okay, we
Okay,
all
gang,
agree on that one.
if you're
All
watching
agree
this
on
on
that one.
YouTube,
Kumbaya.
if you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe to the channel. Really helps me out. Send a super chat. If you're watching this on Kick, follow and you can subscribe there. We just got monetized on Kick. If you're watching me on Twitch, follow me. Give me your Prime subs. Give me some bits. That'll all help. And with that.